myself. If you had thought. Open source intelligence, not only to highlight some of the best work that has been done, in between sessions that have accumulated every 3 or 4 days, to both promote that work, but also to share tools and techniques. We talk to some very interesting practitioners. We often try to have one interview per space. Tonight, in a few minutes, we'll be speaking with the Bald Geek, who is an expert at some flight tracking, particularly on the more data-intensive side. So I think that will be a great conversation. So in addition to promoting OSINT work, tools and resources, part of the idea is also just to have a space where people can come together if they like to hear about updates in OSINT, and they might get inspired by some of our speakers. After we do our interview, we'll just have a roundtable, which often focuses on developments in Ukraine and aspects of OSINT that can be applied to evaluating that news. And the hope is that we'll get great conversations going and potentially develop connections among speakers and participants that might lead to people collaborating, working together on new projects as well. I often like to start out a space. It might be a little bit slow to start, but to point out new resources. And that way it lets the room warm up a little bit. And I know that usually the folks who show up in the first few minutes are pretty dedicated to the concept. I rely pretty heavily on use of the nest, which is the space at the top, or the area at the top of the space's screen, where you can put links, because I like to try to support most of what I speak to. And so you'll see lots of content up there as I'm going through discussions of the news. That way you can follow along. The first item, which is all the way on the right-hand side at the moment, is my agenda for tonight. If you click through to that thread, there are lots and lots of links that are categorized by topic. That's what we'll get into when we get to our roundtable discussion later tonight. Feel free to have a look through it as we're having our conversation. If any of it sparks your interest, if you wind up having a question or a comment, when we come to the discussion portion, then we'd love to have you come up and speak, even if you are new to the space, have not spoken before. I'll begin just by going through a couple of resources. So it's the third item back in the nest now. It's the tweet that's titled Calendar and Events. We have built this community calendar. Part of the motivation was that the Spaces search function is not very good. And it can be very hard even to find spaces that are hosted by people we know, friends of ours. So we wanted to bring them all together to highlight spaces that are often discussing either OSINT or the developments in Ukraine. There are a few in there that are, just spaces that are matters of interest to those in our little group. That might not be on those two issues, some historical talks and things, but you might find those interesting as well. We've also tried to build the calendar out to include outside events, often, think tanks, universities that are holding interesting conversations about the war, or about OSINT. So we wanted it all in one place. So if you click through that link to the Team Up calendar, you'll see the individual entries. They almost always have a link that goes through to a registration page for outside events or to the Spaces invites. And that way you can set them up in your own calendar or sign up. There were 3 items I wanted to note. The 2 events, one of which is a hearing that's on the oversight of assistance to Ukraine that's going to be held in the U.S. House Foreign Relations Committee. That's of interest, I know, to several of us who are following the aid to Ukraine. That's going to be held on the 29th, and I understand it's going to be broadcast, so I think you can find the link to the broadcast through that tweet of the House Foreign GOP Committee. The other event that's coming up in the next week or so is an event held by Bellingcat, which is a training session on advanced scraping techniques. And so some friends of the space I know already are running scraping programs. We know some folks who, for example, were running scraping on Telegram in various foreign languages. And they were then taking those results, translating them from Russian and Ukrainian into English, and then posting them on Twitter or processing them otherwise. This is a bit of training on similar techniques. Intriguingly, in order to even get into the registration link, you have to answer a basic programming puzzle. So there is a bit of a bar, but check it out if you're interested. The last item I thought I would highlight there is not an event, but it's actually a survey that's been put up by the Twitter account Ukraine Weapons Tracker that many of us know. They do good work. And like several organizations that we've spoken to, like GeoConfirmed and War Translated, Ukraine Weapons Tracker is now trying to expand its offering and go beyond the limitations of, the word limit on Twitter and so on. And so in order to do that, they'd like to understand how best to get information to those who are interested. So that survey is set up so they can get feedback on how to present a better offering. So I'd encourage you to fill it out. I also have a tweet up with some of the podcasts from the last week. I'll just run through a handful so as not to run on too long. There are 2 up there where one of the main speakers is General Ben Hodges. There is one of his just on the overview of the war in Ukraine. And then there's another that is on the large-scale combat operations in Ukraine from a social science perspective. So you may enjoy those talks. There was another episode this last week of the Russia Contingency, which is the talk done by Michael Kaufman that's hosted. It's different from War on the Rocks, but it's hosted in their sort of collection of podcasts. That one is subscriber only, but you may be interested. And then the last podcast from this last week I found interesting was one done by Radio Free Europe, speaking with Mark Galliotti and a few other guests, specifically about the fallout of the International Criminal Court arrest warrant issued for President Putin. So you may enjoy that conversation as well. I'll go through 2 more resources, and then we'll move on to our conversation with our guest today. Just before getting to those resources, I will note that friends of the space are actually streaming this conversation onto YouTube as well. And they've convinced me to turn a camera on myself. So if you'd like to see some of the tweets, the graphics from the tweets along with a little bit of video and hear our conversation, you can check it out at the link that is in the nest posted by Jacoby. And I'd encourage you to stay on Twitter. That way you can participate in the conversation because on YouTube you can only listen, but you may be interested in checking it out later because the broadcasts should live there as a repository. The 2 resources, so I'm going to put them up individually. as is often the case, the first is a thread that's been put up by the account Cyber Detective, who I chat with occasionally. And that goes through explaining the process, how you can download photos from Instagram, even if you don't have authorization to access the account. Often accounts are protected, and you may be doing research. For example, many of us have probably seen some of the research done by Bellingcat, and they will occasionally be digging through Instagram profiles. So if you'd like to learn about how to download photos from otherwise inaccessible accounts, you can walk through that thread. The other tool is one that we've only experimented with a little bit. So that, this is sort of buyer beware, but it's highlighting a site called facecheck.id that is actually meant to be a reverse image search for individuals' faces to try to find those same faces in social media posts. When we experimented with it, we ran my photo through it, and the only result it pulled up, I do have my photo, in my profile here on Twitter, and I have my photo, so a handful of photos on, a Facebook account and so on. The only photo it managed to find of me, or find that resembled me, was of a gentleman in Florida who had been arrested for dealing methamphetamine. But that might not, be indicative. It might work better in some cases than others. So it's worth checking these things out. Okay. All right. So just in the meantime, just to make sure I have a second co-host, the co-host we had invited just hasn't arrived yet. So I'm going to invite my regular co-host Jacoby just as backup. And now that that's done, I think we're ready to move on to our conversation with our guest today. Our guest is the Bald Geek. And as I mentioned in my introductory comments, he is heavily involved in the world of flight tracking, particularly the data-heavy side of it. And in chatting with my co-host, had a chat with you a little bit earlier, and they said that the Bald Geek was a bit of a mouthful, and that you had proposed that we could just call you Baldy. But I've realized that I've cleverly set my username up so that everybody has to call me Mr. Bond. So I hope you don't mind. Maybe I'll call you Mr. Geek. Does that work for you?
That works for me. Thank you very much for the invite, and great to meet you.
Perfect. So many of us who have been following OSINT work on Twitter will regularly see posts by some of the great flight tracking accounts. And, they'll produce everything from individual flight tracks. They'll look at Takamo, labeling of military flights. They'll produce sort of weeks or months-long patterns of whether they be ISR flights or cargo flights that are relevant to the war. And, some of these accounts are well-known, like Gerjon or Evergreen Intel. My understanding is, by way of analogy, so I know a little bit about computer networking, and that there is this multi-layer model where you have some very fundamental layers sort of at the bottom in terms of the physical and the transport and network layers. And then you have the more, the higher layers that are more about specific application use. And in my mind, I was mapping this onto sort of the way that OSINT is conducted, in that some OSINT is like the infrastructure of OSINT, and others are more at the higher end where it's analytical. They're not collecting the data. They're just trying to make sense of it. And, they do it much more publicly. And so in thinking about it that way, it struck me that you may be much more toward the infrastructure end of flight tracking. Is that a fair analogy?
I see why you would say that, Mr. Bond, but I respectfully have a slightly different view to that.
Sure.
Traditionally, the way OSINT is done and the people that you mention They look at the aircraft latitude and longitude on a map, and so you can follow the aircraft flight in real time, often hours, obviously if it's an oceanic flight, but that's only latitude, longitude, and airspeed and altitude. The other thing that they send out that I really focus on is every now and then the aircraft, the flight crew, will send what's called an ACARS message. It's a text message, and you'll hear me say ACARS a lot tonight. It's an acronym: Aircraft Communication Addressing and Reporting System. And literally, just think of it as an SMS from the aircraft. So while they're following the flight in real time, latitude and longitude, they're looking at the icon on a map. What's going on in the background that no one has really looked at very much before is these ACARS messages. And this is kind of a big deal, because you'll be looking at a map and you'll see an aircraft take a 90-degree turn, or perhaps sometimes, quote, even worse, unquote, it'll do a U-turn and it'll just come back the way it was. Well, what happened? If you're looking at the map, you're like, why the right turn? Why the left turn? Why did it turn around? Well, what I provide, rather than sort of infrastructure, is any ACARS message that I can pick up from that aircraft will end up on the website in real time. So you're looking at a map, and hopefully you're looking at my ACARS site, you're looking at the hex, the ICAO address of that aircraft, and you can correlate, oh, they've got a fuel problem. Oh, they've got a pressurization problem. Oh, they've, the bad weather and they've got to turn around because they don't have enough fuel for the headwind. Literally, sometimes in clear English like that, you'll see an ACARS message explaining it, and often there won't be any ACARS message, and we'll all be left wondering what's going on. So what I offer through ACARS reception and correlation and putting it on the website is just another piece of the puzzle.
Well, I appreciate that. I hadn't understood sort of the unique data that's provided by ACARS. And in doing a little bit of background prior to our talk tonight, I saw that you've put up a link to what you say is the best description of ACARS that you've found. And I've taken the liberty of putting a few of the links relevant to our conversation together into one tweet, and that tweet is up in the nest right now. So if you're listening, you may want to check out that first tweet that's titled Guest Background Links. And so the first link is to that description you had highlighted as being one of the best. Could you give us maybe a little bit of background on how ACARS works? Because it sounds like it's fairly complicated in that it can be transmitted over at least half a dozen different platforms, satellite, a more conventional radio, potentially cell phone. Could you describe how all of that is working?
Yeah, sure, because it is confusing, and it is, exactly as you pointed out, multi-mode, multi-frequency. So the best way to sort of delineate it is over land and over water. And when I mean over water, I'm talking over the ocean, not the Great Lakes necessarily up in North America. So over land, you have a network of ground stations that pick up the ACARS messages on what's called VHF, very high frequency. It's like the ATC, air traffic control, voice frequency, when the air traffic is directing traffic. That's over VHF. The FAA has covered the USA and the world in VHF ACARS ground stations. So when an aircraft, domestic or military, generally is over the US, Europe, UK, South America, North America, Alaska, they're picked up by these, around 250-mile radius sort of range, because the aircraft is nice and high, sometimes further. And so any ACARS comes through that method. Over the ocean, there is no ground stations. And so what happens there is twofold. If the airline, if the military so choose to take the expense, because satellite data is expensive, the aircraft transmits a message up into space to a geostationary satellite. on one frequency, and then that satellite rebroadcasts the ACARS message back down to Earth on another frequency. Because it just sprays it, far and wide down, we can then, just park an antenna outside looking up at the satellite, and we can then get that aircraft message via the satellite, that ACARS message. So that's over the ocean. Now, if you can't afford satellite time, the last option or the other option is HF, or high frequency. And that's that, the old classic static ridden, funny noises. Very cheap though. And there is a good handful, more than a dozen or so HF ground stations. And so your ACARS message, position data, wind speed, altitude, things like that could be sent over HF. Some aircraft use both satellite and HF over the ocean. Some aircraft use satellite and VHF over land. Some aircraft use a combination, there's lots of different combinations. So they're your three main, land-based, VHF, very similar to FM, it's kind of close. AM radio is a bit too far away, but FM is sort of getting up into that VHF range. And then your satellite, which is two different frequencies, what's called L band and C band. And we can get into that if you want to, but basically C band requires a satellite dish around 6 to 8 foot at least. L band just requires a small patch or helix antenna. And then HF requires, a good bit of wire, or sometimes it's called a loop antenna or something like that. So there's lots of ways for OSINT folk or enthusiasts to get involved in any combination of reception of ACARS.
So really these text messages that contain more context than just latitude and longitude, they're being broadcast periodically by these flights, but that they're being broadcast both through different platforms, potentially on different frequencies, and in places all around the world. And so I imagine the challenge is just establishing sort of a big net that can catch as many of them as possible. Is that what you're working on building out?
That exactly, Mr. Bond, you just got it right there. So there's been a few people that have tried to set this up in the past, but really the data was sort of very hard to correlate and put together into one place. So that was sort of my goal, was to bring all this disparate information together into one place. And sort of quick funny backstory, I started with what's called ADSB. So that's the very common, you mentioned off quite a few of the different flight trackers, been around for more than a decade. And I was wondering, well, I'm like, what else is out there? And I very quickly discovered ACARS and fell in love with it, because it explained why that airplane made that U-turn or that right turn, medical emergency, diverting to Las Vegas. And wow, you can see it on the map. And so I started raving about it on Discord and different forums and stuff like that. And I was sort of the lonely voice, but I didn't give up. And everyone eventually got sick of me, and they gave me my own Discord channel, my very first ACARS Discord channel. And so I was sort of really talking it up in there. But thankfully, my enthusiasm was infectious. And so other people started to put their radios together and started to get the data. And they're like, well, what do we do with the data? And I'm a bit of a networking computer geek. And I said, well, send it to me on this particular port, a computer port. And I'll build a little website and we'll put it together. And that's how it's all sort of started about 5 years ago. And here we are. And so now we've got another guy, Kevin, who's really also got the enthusiastic infection of ACARS, and he's putting together a website, airframes.io, and that's going to be the one to watch. I have no clue what I'm doing, and I openly admit that I have no clue. Kevin and I work very closely together, and I've told him all the mistakes that I've made, and he's really doing it right, and it's really exciting to see Airframes.io take off. So that was a long answer, but you are so right. And the real key piece for me was, after I got my satellite dish up, a guy in Australia who's been interested in this space but didn't have the know-how to put a dish together. I remotely talked him through how to do it over text messages and emails and photos, and he got his satellite dish all up and tuned and running, and he fed his data to my site. Very shortly after that, because we had half the planet covered at that point, a guy in the UK also caught the bug. He set up a satellite dish with a little bit of assistance from me, sends his data to my site, and now we have the 3 main geostationary satellites, and we have global coverage of latitude, longitude, airspeed, but also ACARS messages from the Immersive geostationary satellites, and that's been the real wow moment for ACARS and OSINT.
Okay, so you touched on a lot of things that I'd like to expand on over the next little while. Before getting into how you're building out your network, I was hoping to go back a little bit. You mentioned that it was about 5 years ago that you started to, I think you described it as falling in love with the idea of ACARS. Had you been involved in flight tracking, or it sounds like you have a pretty extensive background in communications technologies. Had you been involved in flight tracking or satellite communications for some time before your interest in ACARS developed?
Not really, actually. I'm a ham radio or amateur radio operator from my teenage years. From about 13, 14 years old, I got my ham ticket. So I've had a passion for radio my entire life. And I'd actually done what's called EME, Earth, Moon, Earth. So where you bounce a signal off the moon, you use the moon as a passive reflector. To do that, 25, 28 years ago, you need a decent sized satellite dish. And so I put up a decent sized satellite dish in my backyard in Australia. And so I was very comfortable with tracking the moon and tuning up a radio to receive a signal from a distant thing in orbit. So when I sort of got interested in ADSB when I moved to America, to California, I spun up, did the usual thing. I got my little USB radio called SDR, software defined radio. It's a little dongle about the size of your thumb. One end plugs into the USB port of your computer, the other end has an antenna connector on it. So I got that going, and I saw planes on a map, and I immediately, my thought just jumped to, well, if they're sending this out, what else are they sending? I didn't know about ACARS really at that point. And very quickly, just doing some Google search, not only ADSB on this frequency, but ACARS on this frequency. So boom, straight away, use my SDR to tune in to the ACARS. Once I saw the text messages, I was just enamored. And my background also in computers and computer networking, my day job, by the way, I'm an industrial automation engineer. And so the satellite dish needs to track the geostationary satellite, because even though the name says geostationary, it's not. They actually orbit a big fat 8 in the sky every 23 hours, 54 minutes. So I have to automate the dish to get the what's called the TLE, two-line element, satellite position data from NORAD every 24 hours. And then I update my satellite dish position every 5 minutes. So I had to automate all of that. And so all of these pieces and parts sort of had to come together, but I was comfortable with all of them enough that even though I wasn't heavily involved in ADSB, the position tracking, I had the skill set, the broad skill set to put up a satellite dish, to automate its tracking, to pull all the pieces and parts together. So it was a pretty fun couple of months getting it off the ground, and then sort of documenting it and trying to help other people along the way.
Well, that's a fascinating story in that we've had a couple of guests on now. While occasionally a few guests have been doing work, OSINT work, online work that's aligned with their day jobs. We've had a few on who, have been doing fairly high level work. And when I've asked them, what's your background in that? They've said, well, I just got interested in it and I taught it to myself. One example of that, I actually see him in the audience, is Nalcio, who tracks equipment losses in the war in Ukraine, and explained that, it's not aligned with his day-to-day work. It's just something he decided to teach himself. So I really appreciate those stories. And your story is interesting to me because I actually have went out and I got my ham license as well, just 2 or 3 years ago. But I haven't done nearly as much with it as you have. Just put up, the old HF, UHF, VHF antennas. But that's a fascinating background. And so, I guess moving to the way that you're building out this network, you mentioned that you now have 3 folks running the satellite dishes for that communication, and I think you indicated that is more or less global coverage. Is that right?
Yeah, the way the Immersat satellites up, there's 4 of them parked, and the 4th one is weirdly off the coast of the east coast of USA, and it's in use, but it's kind of a backup. We did actually have some data off that for the first time in around January this year, but sadly a big chunk of ice slid off the guy's roof and crushed the dish. But he's got the enthusiastic ACARS bug, and he assures us that come spring, summer, he's going to acquire a bigger dish and put it on a nice concrete pad further away from the house so that he doesn't have any ice problems next year. So, yeah, so the 3 satellites cover basically Asia Pacific, the Americas, and then AlphaSat covers UK, Europe, all the way down to the Cape. So those 3 satellites cover everything in between. There's another mode we haven't talked about yet. We might get to it. I don't want to confuse things too much, but there's another low Earth orbit satellite constellation called Iridium that's been around for years. Some of the listeners may remember it. Motorola. I think I sold it to Microsoft for a little while, and it got sold. It's gone from almost bankruptcy to almost bankruptcy. Terribly sad. But the thing with Iridium was basically a predecessor of Starlink in that the satellites relay satellite to satellite till they get above a satellite that's above the ground station, and then it downlinks. So you only need a few ground stations. So the Iridium constellation, the reason I mention that is the Immersat geostationary don't cover the poles, because where they are sort of above the equator, their satellite antenna coverage sort of really fades off above the poles. Iridium, because it's low Earth orbit constellation, has fantastic global coverage. Now the satellites are moving very, very quickly, but they pick up any aircraft information and relay it, and so it covers the poles as well. But the aircraft obviously needs the appropriate transmitter to transmit to either Iridium or Immersat. So I'm actually, I don't want to get too much off into the weeds, but one of the tasks, of the many tasks we've got at the website, is to build an aircraft equipment database so that we know per aircraft which transmitters are applicable for that aircraft. Usually it's included in the load sheet. So when an aircraft is going to take off, they send an ACARS message of a load sheet saying, this is my weights and balances, this is my fuel on board, this is the number of passengers, SOB, souls on board, or PAX passengers. And they often will include a seemingly random 12 to 15 digit character string. Well, you can actually pull that apart and you can find out which equipment that aircraft is carrying. And so we can build up this database of what, do they have Iridium? Do they have HF? Do they have VHF? What do they have? So yeah, the global coverage with the 3 stations is really critical. And then as we roll out Iridium, we're probably going to need 50, maybe not 50 stations, but we're going to need quite a few stations there. For the VHF, we're going to need thousands. So if anyone listening has an ADSB set up already and they want to add ACARS, please reach out to Airframes or to myself, and let's help you through that, because we need lots and lots of VHF ground stations for sure, Mr. Bond. So if I can put that encouraging plug in there, the infectious enthusiasm, I'm all for it.
We're all for infectious enthusiasm, and because I have a VHF set up myself, now I'm thinking, oh, maybe I can help out. So this may be repeating what you said, but essentially there are the geostationary satellites, there are the low Earth orbit satellites, and then there are the radio, the VHF. Those are the three major transmission modes. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yep.
Okay.
And then the last one is HF, which is still in use, and there's a surprisingly large amount of military aircraft using HF.
Okay. And the numbers you had attached to those were the geostationary satellites. You have 3 dishes already contributing to the project, which sounds like it might be sufficient coverage. But if somebody had a dish and wanted to contribute, would that help you? Would it provide a backup and be valuable, or are you set at that geostationary mode level?
No question, we would love to have a backup. And here's why. You might get a downpour of rain somewhere in, the UK, for example, and if it's
an ice sheet, as you just described.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, a second data feed is awesome, but I know 6 to 8 feet satellite dishes is a tough sell for homeowners and their companions. I have a very understanding wife. She actually let me put it in her flower garden. Moving right along. And so, yeah, I understand a satellite dish is a tough sell, but yes, absolutely. What we're trying to encourage is, back in the 80s when TV used to be over satellite, and you could sometimes get some unencrypted TV channels in the 80s, just, and it was a lot of fun to pick this up. Those dishes are still collecting rain and dust in people's backyards, and they're often happy for them to be, disassembled and removed. So sometimes you see them show up on secondhand marketplaces for a song, and buy to remove for free. And so we're encouraging people to have a go at that.
And so while you would appreciate even more assistance at that geostationary satellite level, which would be more of an investment with the dish, you then said for the Iridium, the low Earth satellites, you would need about 50. Are you just at the process of building that out now? Do you already have contributors who are picking that mode up?
The Iridium is personally one of my most exciting modes, because we started picking Iridium up on January 30th last year. To my knowledge, my very limited knowledge, but in this space, less limited, we are the only ones. And I say we because I want to include the whole OSINT community, AV Geek community, who's got behind me. So while I may have set the first one up, ironed out a lot of the bugs, and got the data onto my website, we've slowly got a good handful. We actually just last week or the week before turned on Hawaii, which was incredibly exciting. I'm chatting with a guy in Sweden, which I'm super excited about because he's way up north, looking at some polar data. I've got a guy that just popped up on Mastodon, I think yesterday, and said, "Hey, I'm in New Zealand. I'm almost finished following your how-to guide, setting up my Iridium station. Can you tell me how to feed it through to your site?" And I'm super excited. We got Cairns, Australia. We've got Germany. We've got the UK. We've got a guy over near New York and a guy down in Florida. So there's about 12 Iridium stations. This is no AV Geek, no OSINT folk have seen Iridium ACARS before, to the best of my knowledge. Nobody else has been pulling this data and extracting it. So Iridium's incredibly exciting. Because the satellites are low Earth orbit, the ground coverage is quite large. So yeah, probably 30 to 50 of those stations would cover it, to your point. But Kevin and I, Kevin from Airframes.io, would definitely, we're looking at 5,000 or more VHF ground stations all through Europe, all through Australia, all through, well, every continent. And if we can get something down near Antarctica, that would be great too, because the New Zealanders fly the ice flights down, and they go SATCOM after they leave New Zealand, but once they get down to Antarctica, that they switch over to VHF. So I would love to get their data from their ACARS data from down on the ice continent.
And so while we've set out sort of these three modes, and we've talked about essentially you could use help by people feeding you data via all three of these modes if they're available. You mentioned that the geostationary requires that 6 to 8 foot satellite dish, as people used to use for their television back in the 80s. For an Iridium setup, what kind of hardware does somebody need?
Well, antenna-wise, that's the really good thing. Iridium, it's almost laughable. The antenna is about the size of your thumb. It's laughably tiny. It's literally a small stub, about as long and a little bit fatter than your thumb. Because it's low Earth orbit, the signal is very loud. Once again, so you connect a piece of cable, a coaxial cable from that small antenna down to what's called the SDR, your software-defined radio, which plugs into your USB port and unfortunately at this stage, most of the decoders are Linux only. So again, that's where big shout out to the open source world. A guy in, I believe he's somewhere around Texas, had a COVID project of building a Linux, what's called distro or distribution ISO, a copy of a bootable copy of Linux that was focused on software-defined radio. And he had a couple of pieces of aircraft decoding data, but not the full suite. So I reached out to him on Twitter and said, could I encourage you just to add these couple of pieces of software? And if you could do that, this would be amazing for AV Geek, OSINT, radio, ACARS. And he was 110% on board. And Dragon OS is now available for Raspberry Pi and for laptops and PCs, x86 computer hardware. And everything you need is on there, from HF, VHF, L-band to C-band. All of the software is available on Linux, all pre-installed, all pre-built. It's a very smooth startup. So it's as plug as play as we can possibly make it. On top of that, Kevin is working on a specific another distribution, another Linux distribution that's going to make it even simpler and even leaner and even more ACARS focused. And it's a ways off yet, but we're starting to kick the tires on that. I just want to be clear there, because you asked about the equipment. It is Linux, and I know that's a bit of a catch for some people, but Kevin and Mr. Dragon and myself are doing everything we possibly can to make the startup as smooth as possible.
Okay, so having covered what the modes are, that you could use help in all of the different modes, we understand what the hardware is essentially to receive from all these modes. So this might be a time where it would be helpful for the audience to look at that tweet that's in the nest that includes links to Mr. Geek's various sites. If you have your hardware, whether it be a dish or an Iridium receiver or a software-defined radio, my understanding is then you might have something like Dragon OS that would run your radio, but in order to decode the ACARS messages themselves and process them in a way that they contribute to your project, I understand you have a GitHub for that. Is that right?
That's correct. So to be clear, the Dragon, or soon coming Airwaves OS, has the decoding on there and has the software to do local logging, but then also transmit that data to either airframes or perhaps my site. I see my site as a bit of a stopgap. It's unique at the moment in that I very specifically, in response to overwhelming OSINT interest, I fork all my ACARS messages, civil and military. And so there's sort of Jekyll and Hyde aspects to my site, which is the link is in the nest. Thanks. and also Airframe's link is on my GitHub. So you can feed my site to get that split at the moment. In time, once Airframes continues to build out, we're already talking about how to display military aircraft separately from civil aircraft. On that point, my site gets around about 500,000 messages a day. Airframes, the numbers of millions of messages that Kevin gets a day, his site is astonishing. It's in the order of 30 or 40 per second. You can't read that. No one can read that. You're going to drown in it. And I think your side's kind of taking the conversation this way, Mr. Bond, and you're right, it's probably about time. That's the real key then, is to take those text messages and to one by one, and this is where, computer power is great because it can do it very quickly. As each and every ACARS message comes in, we can sift through it. The very first test is, are you civil or are you military? What is the origin, the aircraft origin of this message, civil or military? And then based on that fork, further sifting and refining and translating and presentation of the data then on the website is the real amazing OSINT stuff.
And so to explain, maybe repeating some of what you just said to us, but to explain to the listeners, the 3 links, so there's the introduction to what ACARS is, and then there are 3 links to projects that are associated with Mr. Geek. The first is his GitHub, which has some of that software that can help you get set up that he just explained will ultimately be included in some of these OS distributions, which simplifies things. Then there's a link to a site that is hosted, you say generously, on ADSB Exchange. That I think that's the temporary site that you're referring to, where it explains your project and has links to various forums that you maintain. It has links to the airframes.io site, and it sort of has a little monitor at the top using graphics to show which data feeds are up right at the moment. And then the third link is to airframes.io, which is the project being run by your friend that you're also working on, that ultimately will be automating the collection and aggregation of all of that data. And so the search feature that you have on your site on ADSB, will that kind of search function be replicated on airframes.io ultimately, and you won't sort of need to maintain your own?
Absolutely. And
okay.
And this is, and you just summed it up beautifully, Mr. Bond. Thank you. I'm glad my nervous stumbling here is coming through. So absolutely, Airframes IO and myself working very closely. He's not repeating my mistakes. Again, to be clear, I'm not a programmer. I don't know how to build a website. I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. I can't sort of say that enough. But here we are. So I'm really glad that Kevin at Airframes is taking the time to build the foundation. It's been an incredible journey for me personally the past 5 years, because this has grown very quickly and very organically. As I get feedback from OSINT folk about aircraft messages, I have been able to iterate fairly quickly and present that data back at them while making notes that I didn't know, Kevin was going to come along. And wow, has he ever come along in behind? And so he said, well, what about this? What about that? How does this work? How does that work? And here's the key. I rushed to put it in place. I was so excited to help these OSINT guys get their data. Kevin is not rushing. He has a long game. He's methodical. He's a real programmer. He's putting in massive databases. Again, I mentioned 500,000 a day. I had to, initially when I first published my site, 5 years ago, the data was live. You couldn't do a search on it. And then finally everyone said, can you put a week-long search on it? Well, I put a week search on it. In other words, a 1 week rolling buffer. Well, it very quickly filled up with 500,000 a day, and it was taking 3 or 4 minutes to do a search on 1 week's data. So if you wanted to look up an aeroplane, didn't matter whether it flew 30 seconds ago or 4 days ago, it took 30, 40 seconds. And so obviously I got complaints that it was too long. So I made it 1 day, 24 hours. The search went down to about 3 seconds, but everyone said, no, 24 hours is too short. So my site has 48 hours. It's been 48 hours now for 3 or 4 years. It's just a rolling 48 hours of flight history of ACARS. Kevin is keeping everything forever. I don't know how he does that. And you can search back months and months and it will pull it up in milliseconds. So he's taking the long range on it. I want to keep, I want my site to be the fast iterating, fast burning dumpster fire. We all joke my site's a dumpster fire. I'd like to keep that going. I'd like to listen to OSINT folk. I'd like to iterate fast. I say it on my GitHub, you know, I fail fast, fail often. And by that way, I learn, OSINT learn, and they learn in real time, and we learn together, and then I can pass those learnt lessons at my expense back to Airframes.io. So it's a pretty cool environment that we're in, where it's all open source, nothing behind a paywall, nothing filtered, nothing blocked. It's all out there. Everyone sees everything that everything has, that everyone has. So it's a pretty unique 1-2 punch between the two sites.
I mean, it's great that you've found that kind of collaboration so that you can both be iterating quickly, experimenting, but also have sort of the more permanent and stable. So I do have a few more questions for you, but I just thought I'd let the audience know that in a few minutes I'll wrap up with my questions, and I would invite questions from the audience. And so if you have anything that you'd like to speak to Mr. Geek about, please request a mic. It's in the bottom left of the Spaces window, and we'll bring you up to chat. And then if you're enjoying this conversation, we'd like to get as many voices in as possible. I'd invite you to retweet the space, which is the button in the bottom right of the Spaces window. Okay, so how do you imagine that a flight tracker, an OSINT practitioner, do you imagine that they would primarily be monitoring things on ADSB or similar sites and looking for those flight tracks that, you know, make a U-turn or they look unusual for some reason, and then they come and look at your site? Or do you imagine that they would have those sort of mapped tracks up at the same time as ACARS, and maybe they would be seeing developments on your site first? Do you see them as sort of parallel sources?
That is a great and insightful question, and I'll try and make it 2-part. Yeah, absolutely. Look for the U-turn, then do a search of that aircraft on my site or Airframes, and see if there's any ACARS that explain the unusual pattern. And we'll get to unusual here in a minute, but most OSINT folk have a gut feel after a while. You know, yes, this aircraft flies from here to here. Yes, it flies from here to here. Hang on a minute, why is this over here? And you can take a look at it. So there's certainly that live, real time comparing, you know, the flight path, the ADSB data with ACARS, no question. But here's the real magic that an OSINT guy helped me over Instagram. I just got a DM one day on Instagram, and he gave me just the most incredible piece of information called mission codes. And these mission codes turned out to be future forward planning missions. And the OSINT world has really lit up, because what I did again was this iteration of, I detected when there was a mission code in those 500,000 messages a day, and I put them on a separate table. And I was able to tease out over time just by separating them. Someone said, hey, this is a date code. It's a date, a day, 3-4 days in advance. And so I broke it out. And so you can go to my site, and if you look at the mission code table, you will see that a lot of these flights are for March 24th, March 25th. So all of a sudden, you know, this aircraft, often there's an arrival and a departure airport. So you'll know which aircraft flying from where to where a day or two before it flies. This is unbelievable because the track doesn't exist on the flight tracking website yet. So you can go to my site first, see the mission code, see the flight plan, and then wait for the aircraft to show up.
So really, not only could it be, ADSB and similar pushing or prompting people to look at your site, they could be looking at your site to find info that would prompt them to be paying attention to the later flight track as well, which is really interesting.
Exactly. And then anything that has a flight plan in it that I can detect, because again, these ACARS messages have sort of certain signatures. Perhaps yourself and maybe some of your listeners are familiar with a site called Sky Vector, and it has these 5-character waypoint names globally. And so I can take the flight plan and create a Sky Vector URL, and it's on the table. So you can click on that Sky Vector and you will see visually a purple line overlaid on the map of the world, and you'll be able to see where this aircraft is going to fly at this particular date and time in the future.
So just a note for those who have questions, I'll ask 2 more of my own, and then I'll start bringing the audience in. You had, we discussed in some detail ways that people could help you by being data monitors and contributors. When you talk about working on your website and sort of experimenting quickly and, being happy to, experiment fast, fail fast, are you looking for any kind of help in running that system? Would you appreciate the help of programmers? I know you tweeted out just the other day you were working on an SQL database, or are you already able to source help on those kinds of projects from your forums?
No question. I'm going to speak on behalf of Kevin, and he'll probably admonish me or praise me later. I think actually Kevin's on. If he pops up with a question, just ignore him, Mr. Bond. I will speak on behalf of Kevin. He would love, because he's the real programmer. He's in GitHub. He needs the programming help. What I need, and can't strongly enough beg, infectious enthusiasm begging, is the OSINT deep analysis and passion and years often of following these aircraft and maybe looking at ACARS or seeing ACARS maybe for the first time tonight, but having that light bulb moment where that's my aircraft. I've got spreadsheets and pieces of paper for that particular aircraft going back years, and all that aha moment of seeing the ACARS from that aircraft perhaps for the first time. And as soon as they see the ACARS, they see a pattern that I don't. I know this is going to sound really weird, and people sort of look at me like I'm from another planet. I don't have time to use my site. I really, when I look at ACARS, yeah, I kind of get what I'm looking at. But when OSINT people look at the ACARS, their face lights up. They're like that, light bulb moment, the clouds part and the sun shines down, and they're just like, check this out. And I'm looking at it going, So I provide the data and they do the analysis. And so again, this fail fast, fail often, and passing it forward to airframes. If the OSINT folk can help me out and I can show their gold nugget, their needle in the haystack on my site, that then gets iterated through to Kevin for the airframe site, either now or in the future. So Kevin needs programmers, I need OSINT.
Well, that's a great insight. I hadn't anticipated that. And so I am still fairly new to the flight tracking aspect of things, but I do know a few of the flight trackers here on Twitter. So I'll certainly send them along this recording, and hopefully they'll catch that infectious enthusiasm. So my last question before going to hands is, a moment ago you made a reference to understanding what is normal, and I had heard that in chatting with some of my co-hosts, you had talked about, the importance of a deep understanding of what the data is you're looking at when you come to the phase of interpreting it. And I was curious what your thoughts are on that point, and how somebody who might be fairly new to flight tracking could come up the curve in order to establish that normal and do better analysis.
Great question, Mr. Bond, and I unfortunately my answer is slightly lacking because I'm not heavily involved in doing the OSINT side on the messages themselves. I rely on that feedback from others saying, hey, I see this particular pattern in the data. Can you tease it out? Can you change the order? Can you break it into 3 strings of 4 characters each? You know, this sort of stuff. So the other important thing that I want to note is my site is only, 6, I've been doing it sort of 7 years, but the site, well, okay, where my site went viral, I was getting around, I don't know, 300-400 hits a day from 50 users or something. Kabul extraction. A couple of Twitter heavy hitters discovered my site. I have no idea how, but they discovered my site during the early part of Kabul extraction. I went from 500 hits a day to 150,000 hits a day. Just off the chart, insane. And while it's calmed down a little bit from there, it was discovered and it's become very popular. Ever since Kabul, I basically have a full-time job. I have a full-time job as an automation engineer. I have a full-time job just keeping the site running, keeping the feeds up, assisting Kevin, just making people start up their software, their Dragon, their antennas, answering questions. All of that has taken up my time rather than me actually using my site, looking at the data. So it's tough for me. In other words, what I'm saying is I actually have more experience helping people come up to speed building a feeder, the software and the antenna, than I do helping people come up to speed on using my site. It's been in the back of my head for a while, and I have to admit that when this opportunity to speak on your program, thank you again for this opportunity, by the way, I was like, man, I really wish I had a document, a page somewhere that said, ACARS 101 on my site. You've already linked to that incredible DEF CON paper about what ACARS is. It's a great foundation. But how do you actually use my site? And I'm going to have to sort of just pause a whole bunch of activities and just brain dump, for a couple of hours through the keyboard on here's how the different pages on my site, this is what they show. Here's some things you want to look for. Here's some features for this site. People keep asking me for videos. The problem with videos in this space is it's moving so fast that no sooner do I edit a video and upload it to YouTube than Mr. Dragon has updated something. There's a new ACARS message type. It's wow. So this is iterating fast. It's exciting. It's like a startup. It's almost real time. And I just haven't had time to really break down ACARS on the Bald Geek site 101, I'm afraid.
Well, maybe putting the message then out to the audience that we've talked about contributors of the actual data. We've talked about programmers potentially for the airframe.io site. You've talked about OSINT folks. I'll put it out there that if you, listener, do work to develop documentation, or you do video production or development, and you would find it a worthy thing to put in a little bit of time, maybe to help build out some explanatory videos where all Mr. Geek has to do is, tell you about it, and then you take a couple of hours off his time by writing it up, or, producing a bit of a video while you, do your own experimentation through the site. That might be a way to help as well. So keep that in mind. Okay, I'll start going around to hands, and I do invite any other listeners who'd like to ask questions. I'll start with my co-hosts because they help me out so much. Exit, would you like to go ahead?
I would love to. We've talked about the past, and we've talked about a lot of the technology that's used, and it's lots of it is on the older side, like nearly as old as me. Looking into the future, what are some of the possibilities that you see coming? Do you see AI playing a role in this whole story, and what would that look like? What are the exciting things that you see down the road?
Quite a few. I mean, obviously, Iridium. That's incredible. I got tipped off to a tweet, and I quickly dug into it because I could barely believe it a year or so ago. The KC-35 aerial tankers for air-to-air refueling of fighters, they're getting, quote, upgraded, unquote, from Inmarsat to Iridium. And that actually is what sort of really prodded me, because the air-to-air refueling tankers, flight patterns and mission codes and everything is hugely popular on my site. So I sort of felt a responsibility and obligation to, well, let's have a look at this Iridium then. If these aircraft are going to be refitted and I'm not going to be able to track them through the geostationary Inmarsat, we're going to need Iridium. I need to look at Iridium. We need to be ahead of the curve here. So that's what prompted me, was the US Air Force saying, hey, we're going to rip and replace all this stuff for whatever reason. I'm not quite sure. Maybe I don't want to speculate too much. I prefer cold, hard data. But Iridium, okay, so that's obviously the first thing. Second thing, you mentioned machine language, AI. Kevin and I have been brainstorming back and forth for over 3 years, long before COVID, about how to use ML to look at flight patterns, so that left turn on the map when we've got an ML or an AI that says, nah, that aircraft has never ever made a left turn or a U-turn at that point ever before. No human eyes required. The machine is looking at all these flight patterns, and it spits it out, says to a human that says, hey, take a look at this. We don't know what's going on. Also, we want to look at machine learning further with the ACARS data. 500,000 a day on my site, and probably north of 1 million a day on Kevin's site. The better AI, the better machine learning that we can do on these ACAR messages, the better. Also, a lot of these messages aren't OSINT decoded yet. The ACARS manuals, the actual manufacturer manual, are very expensive, and we're hobbyists. We can't afford to buy the protocol manuals, and so we're actually reverse engineering them. And so we could use some help on that, whether it's machine language or whether it's OSINT. Kevin has a fantastic document site with a whole bunch of ACARS labels put out there, and people are slowly plugging in the blanks, which is incredibly awesome. So as we go forward in the future, they'll become clearer, and OSINT folk will know. Kevin and I will do our utmost to provide that extra decoding right there live in the site. So you won't be looking at a 12-digit character string and have to mentally sort of look at another site and, oh yeah, the first 3 of this and the second 4 of that. We'll break it all out for you. So you can just literally read it like a newspaper, what this particular aircraft is sending. So we're very excited about that. And I think just getting more eyes on it into the future, because remember, Iridium is only a year old. We've got 50% of our feeders in the last month over the last year. So I've added 6 feeders in the last month versus 6 feeders in the previous year. So things are taking off at an exciting pace. And so the future looks bright and rosy, because aircraft electronics moves very slow. They're not going to change anything real quick. So we can afford to spend the time and the money and the infrastructure to put this together, because ACARS is not going anywhere for a little while. Sorry, I wasn't sure who I was putting that back to. I think Exit.
Oh, no, I apologize. Exit may have an open mic. I thought occasionally there are glitches between speakers where we can't hear one another. I thought she may have come back in. But in any event, Jacoby, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Sure. My question is going to zoom out a little bit from the great detail that you've been sharing so far, if that's okay. I wanted to bring some of your work and relationships that you have with OSINT flight enthusiasts, flight tracking enthusiasts, toward some current events. A lot of people in the space who frequent spaces watch the news in Ukraine, and both because they're directly involved or because they're interested in everything that's going on there. And a lot of enthusiasts look at flight traffic around Ukraine, around Europe, around Russia, and obviously the tools that they use rely an awful lot, as I understand it, on the grounding of the resources that you provide. And I wonder if you could speak to a little bit of that, about how the resources that you make available in in an open source way are important to that, and how it helps people access more direct information that they see every day, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm trying to tease the question out of that. I'm sorry, because from a logistics point of view, obviously not a lot of Russian-Ukraine aircraft have SATCOM, and there's very few ground stations over that way. So what we saw prior to the invasion was an incredible NATO build-up, tons and tons of equipment. If you remember back, I mentioned about the load sheets. So we saw military load sheets months and months and months. Again, I'm not the OSINT guy, but I remember getting tweets saying, hey, thank you, something's going on. We've seen an uptick in NATO flights, heavy NATO flights flying into NATO bases. I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. And I had to make sure I kept the data flowing, and hey, is there anything I need? You know, like if I see a heavy load sheet, do I pull that out? And they're like, no, not yet, but something's going on. Obviously then when the invasion started, Forte 10, you've all heard about the drone recently. The little guy got taken out, but his big brother has been flying over the Black Sea. I got pinged to, hey, can you pull out all UAVs and put them on a Gantt chart so that we can see how long the UAV has been flying and how long between missions? So I did that. I have a UAV page on my site as a response to that Black Sea UAV surveillance that was been going on since the start, or certainly close to it. So I think, Jacoby, does that get close to some of what you were asking?
Yes, it does. It does. I have some other questions, but I'd also like to hear from other people too. So I'll hold those for later, possibly. Thank you.
Sure, we'll cycle back to you in just a moment. ID10T, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you once again, Mr. Bond, for finding a very interesting guest. Sir, I have two questions, one geek and one more site administration. But actually, I have some feedback. Do I sound okay?
You sound fine to me.
Okay. All right. With your network expanding, has there been any discussions in incorporating any MA GPS data in order to, when that phone's home, you could actually do trilateralization, for example, with mode S, or even IFF, or interrogation friend or foe pings could be identified on that equipment. And for those listening, mode S is yet another transponder that was used prior to the ADS-B transponders. But sir, I'd like your input if that's been discussed at all.
It has, and thank you for the question. I guess I didn't really make it clear right out the gate, and so it's a good chance now to do this. There's been a very, just a personal for me back when I started, and I always nervous speaking for other people, but Kevin and I have had a high-level discussion about this. Neither Kevin at Airframes.io or myself, the Bald Geek here on my site, are deeply interested in duplicating or repeating any of the existing ADS-B, MODES, trilateration hardware setup. Our focus has been on ADS-C, which is the oceanic ADS-B, because there's no ground-based coverage over there, so they uplink their latitude and longitude. So I provide global oceanic latitude and longitude, which then gets fed into, at the moment, it gets fed into ADS-B exchange. This could change. It's a moving target. I don't want to go there. So if you have a question, I'm sorry, I'm going to politely decline it because there's some politics involved there. But right now, my ADS-C global coverage goes to ADS-B exchange. But the key thing that Kevin and I want to focus on is ACARS. Nobody has that. There is no, I mean, there's more than a dozen flight tracking sites. There is 2 ACARS sites at the moment. So that's our focus. Back specifically to your question though, I'm careful with exactly what GPS, MODES, transponder data and everything. Initially, I was just focused on ACARS data. Kevin, on the other hand, he's like, give me everything. Give me as raw and as exposed, closest to bare metal ACARS data that you possibly can. So any and all transponder data, Kevin has the infrastructure to handle that. And the nice thing about it is that we'll be able to do retrospective, like as extra decoders come online, we'll be able to go backwards to Kevin's data and extract that data historically. My site, obviously with 48 hours, we're not going to be able to do that. So I think that answers your MODES, GPS, trilateration question.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. My second would be in regards to information presentation. While respectfully, you are speaking to a group, many of them OSINT are concerned about regional operations. Would you be open, or your team be open to providing links to just regional, say, okay, we have the Ukraine conflict, or there might be something else going on an Air Force base in Italy or something to that effect, hot topics where the community can go and say, hey, something's going on over here, I want to see the messages, and that would be presented on your site.
Yes. So where that actually first came into play was Kabul. When that was happening, my site search page was just getting pounded. People were searching literally just Kabul or the airport there relentlessly over and over and over. And so I very quickly span up a live streaming everything in that region, big geofence, just live straight to that page. And obviously it surged to #1 on my site because people didn't have to keep pressing F5, 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 refresh. They could just open a browser, go to my site, click on the Kabul page, and it just live stream all of the ACARS data there. And very quickly after that, people came and said, hey, can you give me all, wasn't actually by region. Well, it was, I'll explain. So first of all, the request was, show me every US Air Force flight live on a page. Show me every RAF, UK Air Force, show me. And so I quickly spun off a couple of, and then I had a couple of people say, look, I just want Japan, Guam, or North Korea, South Korea. Can you give me pages for that? So I did do that, and I do respond to that. The problem is I'm not a programmer, and my site's what's called an SPA, single page application. So it loads the entire site when any person is just looking at one page. You get the entire back end. So it's horrible, it's nasty. I did mention dumpster fire. And so I have to be careful just how many regional pages I make. Because, if you park on that all day long, you're loading the whole site in the background. So I have to find a bit of a balance. However, again, to throw Kevin under the bus, I'm taking notes. I'm sure Kevin is as well. And it's something that we will discuss and think about, a sort of like a regional geofence. Maybe even have the OSINT person draw the fence around the area they're interested in and just say, you know, make this live. That could be pretty cool.
Well, thanks for that question and answer. So it looks like Exit has another question, and I think Jacoby had one more. So we'll go in that order. Go ahead, Exit.
So this is a question you may not know the answer to, so feel free to say that you don't if you don't. I track ships. They have AIS. I don't know if you know the answer, but I'm wondering if they use the same satellite system, and if those are signals that you guys would pick up with your satellites as well.
Yeah. Okay, let me explain that. Yeah. Okay, so pretty early on my site, I had a guy in Arizona, nowhere near the ocean, his enthusiasm was contagious. Bugged me about STDC. I'm just quickly going to look it up because you've probably all heard of it. It's the broadcast messages to ships, and again, the 4 Immersats carry these STDC. I'm very quickly trying to find what it actually stands for. I'm sorry, I can't find it. But basically, they're downlink messages, broadcast messages to ships at sea. And he bugged me to get that going on my site. And I'm like, dude, I do aeroplanes. I don't do ships. And put him off for a little while. But eventually, I found myself with a few minutes of spare time. I spun up a receiver and very quickly went, oh, there's ejection seat EPIRB messages. There's shipwrecks where airplanes are sent out for search and rescue and things like that. And I went, oh, okay. So I very quickly put it together, talked to my 3 global buddies, and we've since subsequently actually late last year bolstered that infrastructure. And so we now have on my site an STDC page, and it is astonishing. I've actually noticed on Twitter, and I'm sure maybe the 4 of you, or certainly a lot of our listeners, have seen the green text cut paste of ballistic missile tests being announced through STDC, saying, hey, ballistic missile launch, all ships at sea, be careful for falling hazards. And so the tie-in between shipping and aircraft is incredible. That's part 1. Part 2, AIS. I've looked several times at the satellite-based AIS, and there is no open source decoder as yet. And a couple of the guys were actually talking about it on the Airframes Discord this week about, maybe we should do something about that. And so we can't get the satellite AIS. The land-based, the marinetraffic.com, they do have an API. We are looking at incorporating AIS data in airframes. So it is absolutely on our radar, pun intended.
I was quickly searching in the background to try to find that acronym, and I fell down a deep rabbit hole of shipping acronyms. So I wasn't able to find it quickly. It's not an easy thing to track if you're not already familiar with it. Jacoby, I think you had another question. Did you want to go ahead?
Yes, please. This is a little bit of a curvy question. You had said in speaking to you a little bit earlier that, you provide the resource and oftentimes aren't exactly aware of or able to read what you're looking at. And open source enthusiasts have a better feel for what the product that you're producing in a lot of ways. And I'm probably mischaracterizing that, and so I hope you'll correct me. But I'm curious if you, in that realm, whether you see a danger there in making things available, or how, and if you do or if you don't, how you see trying to protect that, or shepherd that information for good OSINT use?
Oh wow, that's a great heavy question. I obviously try and stay out of the way as much as possible. So to the first part of your question, yeah, I mean, I think if I can go back to these mission codes, there's obviously importance in these to many military people. I did the initial and pulling apart and displaying and calculating the future flight date just to help people look at it. I've had some DMs, direct messages over Twitter and things like that saying, I think this might mean this. And I'm like, well, I think I'm not going to code up, because I don't really have the times on, I think. If you can provide me with some solid data that this is, I don't know, 90%, 98% correct, then we can talk about it. But I don't mean to offend anyone, but there's two things about OSINT AV geeks particularly that I've discovered. They are very precise. And if I have a comma, an apostrophe, if I have a wrong airport code, if I have a wrong hex code, wow, do I get to know about it. And the other thing is, so they're very precise, and they certainly like accuracy. The other thing that I've discovered is it is incredibly diverse. I've had people reach out to me that say, I'm only interested in freighters, and not just freighters, but a particular government contracted freighter. And so I want to have you build me a page that only shows this particular, range of freight numbers. I've obviously got to balance that with what I said earlier about these regional places. If I had a table on my site for every OSINT special interest group, my site would be 1,000 pages and running even worse of a slow dumpster fire. And so I think that kind of speaks to where you were maybe headed. I've obviously got to be careful with granting everyone's wish. I'm the genie in the website, the ACARS genie, and a table for you and a table for you. Everyone gets a table. As far as revealing secrets, I think it's still too early for that. We're still digging into this stuff. We're still understanding it. I think probably the closest we've got are these mission codes with future flight dates showing from where to where at this date.
So it looks like that's it for audience questions. I do have one more that has occurred to me just now, and it actually, maybe dovetails with Jacoby's question, which is if ACARS data is a little world of its own that hasn't received a lot of public scrutiny other than, in the last few months or years, maybe two parts. Number one, do you have any concern that some of this detailed information like mission codes that is included now might not be included there or stripped out in future, if it's, acknowledged by the powers that be that this is a closely scrutinized point from the public? And or are you at all concerned about sharing ACARS type information is something that ultimately might get some scrutiny, sort of in the way that the Elon jet, censorship of an individual specific location did a few months ago here on Twitter?
Yeah, great questions. I mean, it's always a popular question with military. If they want to be seen, they turn their transponder on. If they don't want to be seen, they turn it off. They run mode S, and we try and triangulate where they are and try and get close. It's very similar with ACARS. They can encrypt it. They can send it a multitude of other ways. It's kind of a convenience thing. And so could they turn it off? Sure. In a lot of cases they could. Could they encrypt it? Yeah, there's some extra equipment that they can put on aircraft and encrypt it, and we'd still see it, but it wouldn't mean anything. We wouldn't necessarily know which aircraft it came from if it was fully encrypted. So you're right. Are we playing with fire by setting this up and looking at it to the same extent that 30,000, 50,000 ADSB receivers around the world are playing with fire by picking up publicly available information? If a particular millionaire doesn't like knowing where his jet's at, he's took steps to try and mitigate that, and people took steps to unmitigate it. Just as an aside, by the way, we've been reading Elon's ACARs for years. Moving on. So, if you want to dig into it, yeah, sure, you could probably dig up some pretty interesting gold. Back to my point about, well, I think this means this. Oh, okay. Do we want to include that on the site? I've not had, Mr. Bond, Jacoby, I've not had enough compelling data of a decoded message that says, launch the nuke tomorrow. Should that be in an ACARS clear text message? It hasn't come up as yet. I think it's so dynamic. ADSB tracking has been around, as I said, for decades. It's going to be interesting seeing all this unfold. No question. I don't think that really answered it.
It's the standard argument that I tend to agree with, which is that if the data is publicly being transmitted, then it's publicly available. It wasn't just the idea of, should we access it, but so much would some of these people who are including data, cease to include it. And I know they always have the military certainly has the ability to, as you said, encrypt it, turn it off. I'm just wondering if maybe they're taking it for granted that nobody's really looking. And they may not be totally up on the increasing interest in ACARs, but maybe as they become aware of it, the data gets a little bit more standardized or sanitized. But I imagine that's just a question that we'll have to discover in the future. I've seen one more hand go up, so we'll take one last question from the audience, and then we'll move on to sort of the open discussion for the evening. ID10T, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, speaking about military and flight, oftentimes there's a coordination. If it's a air mobility command, then they're talking on clear channel with the ground controllers of, say, Dayton International Airport, just the same as they would as a commercial operation. In the events that they're switching over to the higher UHF frequencies, military UHF frequencies, there's often a coordination or a NOTAM, notice to airmen, sent out, or to other traffic controllers, so they know that the military is in operation in that zone. That said, with your system, have by chance you put in any kind of readers for the ACARS messages for hot topics, a common word search, or when a message comes through, do you have any parameters set in that reads that message? And if there's something interesting that you've put in that parameter and sends you an alert?
I do, yeah. So we didn't talk about it. It's a side project, but I have a Telegram bot channel, and so I test a lot of exactly what you mentioned: trigger words, trigger phrases, trigger ACARs. Again, I'm very mindful of polluting my site with, well, what's this look like? What's it look like? And it's very hard for me to change anything on my site without ruffling somebody's feathers, or because, oh, this looks different now. I like the way it looked before. We've all been there. Twitter changed the face layout, Snapchat changed this, Facebook changed that. So it's been around enough now. It's sort of kind of set in cement, but I still want to play. And so I have a Telegram channel because the software that I use, this whole thing is built on, had just a really sweet Telegram plugin. So that's the only reason I picked Telegram. People have got Political, Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram. There's pros and cons for all of them. The software had a nice interface for it, and so I'm using it. It's a good way for me to experiment. And those people that come to me say, well, I think it means this. And so sometimes what I'll do, if they're persistent and their enthusiasm is undeniable, I might invite them if they're not already on Telegram, and I'll put together a bot for them, and then they can look at it, I can look at it, and then they come back to me and say, yeah, that you're right, that didn't really work. Now that we see it in isolation, and I've watched it for a month, yeah, I'm sorry. Great, no problem, delete the code, kill the Telegram channel, move on. And my site hasn't been impacted. If, on the other hand, it turns out to be something good, then it can migrate from Telegram to the site. So great question.
Okay, well, so Mr. Geek, you've been very generous with your time. I think you've been a very engaging guest, and it's a fascinating topic. I learned a lot tonight myself. Just for the audience, as a recap, some areas we discussed, you could help out Mr. Geek if you'd like to, include potentially reverse engineering some of those manuals he was talking about, potentially helping him develop sort of walkthroughs of how his site works. The site airframe.io could use programmers if you have experience there. Mr. Geek would appreciate any experienced OSINT flight tracker folks who might be able to give insight into the meaning of some of the ACARS messages. And then finally, of course, anybody who can contribute by being a data node collecting the ACARS messages on whatever mode of communication works for you. That would be valuable as well. And so I presume if you follow the links in that guest background links thread that's in the nest, you'll see that Mr. Geek has several forums, and he also has a Discord. So I actually joined the Discord myself. I didn't, if you're interested, I'd encourage you to do that. And I presume, are you open to those who would like to help you out to just message you here on Twitter?
First of all, Mr. Bond, that was a fantastic summary of, call to action. Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. My tweets are public and my DMs are always open. So I encourage people to reach out, and I'm more than happy to click delete on invites to cryptocurrency groups, which I'm sure, yeah.
we all get, absolutely. Okay, well, that's great. And then, hopefully we will follow your project, and then maybe in a couple of months we can have you back. And, because it's so fast moving, we'll hear about the latest upgrades.
That's fantastic. Once again, thank you for this opportunity to speak. And yeah, I'm going to hang around. And if you want me back, sure, absolutely. That'd be great fun. Thank you.
Okay, guys. So we're going to move on to sort of open discussion. By open discussion, I often develop topics that we can walk through. And if any of the topics pique your interest, whether it be a question or an additional point you'd like to add in, I encourage you to do that. If you'd like to speak, just request the mic. It's the button in the bottom left of the Spaces window. If you're enjoying the conversation, please do retweet the space. It's the button in the bottom right. That way we'll get as many people into the conversation as possible. And so I have, just before moving into the open conversation topics, these next items, I often like to point out what I think are good examples of OSINT from the last few days. And so I've put some tweets up in the nest. I may highlight a few of them. Of course, if any of these spark your imagination, please do come up to speak to them. So starting with, it's actually, I think, the third item back in the nest under good examples, a few that we have here. There was an interesting thread put up. I'm having trouble opening the links from my own tweet. Let me see if I can do it from the thread itself, if you just bear with me. Just for those listening, I upgraded my version of Twitter to get around the Android bug that was affecting us for about a week. And so some of the interface is a little bit different for me this week than it has been in the past. Yeah, okay, I can do it this way. So I'll add these to the nest. There was an interesting thread put up that discussed the use of AI in the analysis of image intelligence. And so it was looking at airfields, airfield satellite imagery in particular. And it goes through some of the ways that AI was used for that purpose. And I know that AI has been a hot topic, what with the Chat GPT-4, I think 4 is now out, and the Mid-Journey upgrades and so on. And it has been a frequent question that has been raised to our guests about how can AI or machine learning, maybe to be more general about it, how could it be used in your specific area of research in OSINT? And so that's an example where somebody has actually begun to use it in satellite analysis. Another interesting example was from the company Synthetic AI. And they have a thread that I've just added to the nest, and hopefully it should, just double checking it's populating. And it should populate in just a moment. So the AI on satellite imagery I talked about is now up in the nest. This one tracking the Chinese balloons, has populated for me now as well. So that was another interesting example of tracking space-based data, which is not a subject I see a lot. It's sort of beyond the average flight tracking. So you may be interested in that as a good example of OSINT this week. There was also a breakdown using satellite imagery ground photography. It's going up in the nest now. Satellite imagery and ground photography to break down the recent unmanned surface vessel attack on the port of Sevastopol by a pretty regular OSINT account, D. Mojivensis, who we've used his examples in the past. So you might appreciate his work there. I'll just do one or two more. So maybe what I'll go to, so I would encourage you to look at the long thread that is below the sort of agenda, because there are 4 or 5 more examples. I just won't go into all of them. I may go into, so there was a cautionary example that I'll go to, which is just this morning, for example, the Ukrainian General Staff put out a post on Facebook where they were saying that the Russians had withdrawn their forces from Kakhovka, which came as a shock. And, it quickly went around here on Twitter as surprising that the Russians would do that. But since it came from the Ukrainian General Staff, people said, well, okay, that must be what's happened. I wonder why the Russians would have done that. But then just a few hours later, the General Staff came out and said that they were still temporarily in Kakhovka, and that the information about the alleged withdrawal was made public as a result of the incorrect use of available data. And so I only bring that one up to highlight to you that even sometimes official sources will make errors, and that if a data point comes up that seems unexpected to you, even if it comes from an official source, it's worth trying to cross-check, verify with people on the ground to the extent you can, or even if it's coming from the Ukrainian side, see if any of the Russian bloggers are writing about it, or vice versa. If it comes from the Russians, see if the Ukrainians are acknowledging it. One other cautionary example is, while there was conversation earlier this week about Russia beginning to move T-55 and T-54 tanks It wasn't clear they were moving them necessarily into Ukraine. They were just moving east to west within Russia so far. We'll find out, if they wind up being deployed in Ukraine or not. This cautionary example, it should appear in the nest in just a moment. It's Oliver Alexander noting another well-known account that claims to be doing OSINT work, who found a video of an even older tank model, I believe a T-34, on a train, and suggested that it may be going to Ukraine as well, which is kind of building on the enthusiasm of declining Russian equipment stockpiles. But Oliver Alexander, who's pretty responsible, was able to go and discover that the video was actually from 2019, and it was moving tanks as a gift from Russia to Laos. And so once again, that's a caution of old videos, and just because an account is well known doesn't mean that they're maintaining high standards in the info that they put out. Okay, just doing some administration for a moment. Sure, we have a couple of hands, so we'll go to Allrock first and then to Aaron. Allrock, go ahead.
So I wanted to piggyback. You can hear me, right?
Yep, coming through loud and clear.
Okay. I just wanted to piggyback on your talk about like the T-54, 55 thing. We only saw a video of them getting moved westward within Russia. There really isn't much in terms of what we saw other than a few pictures and 2 videos, one of which was not taken within the past week. It was from much earlier. Whenever you have some of these things, like when, apparently the Russians were incorrectly stated moving from Novokakhovka, or Chuck talking about T-34s or whatever, you have to kind of look at it from a situational view of, does this make sense? Like, what would they have to gain to do this? The only thing that I find believable is the T-54, 55 thing, in a very broad sense of them using them as self-propelled guns. I don't see them be used as actual tanks. They won't have any benefit there. You also have an ammo supply problem and a whole bunch of other issues with them using those tanks. Them bringing them up to the front line is a very low probability. More than likely they're being scrapped, but we don't know, and we won't know for a decent amount of time. And again, if they are getting sent to the front, the only thing that they would be doing would be providing fire support. If they were being used as mainline tanks, or as, in some people have suggested, as static defensive positions, they're not really well suited for that, and it would make them even more vulnerable than they already are, even especially like a static defensive position. But with any claim, as Michael has said, you need to take it, pull it out, and go, does this make sense? Are the Russians going to retreat from Novokakhovka? No, it doesn't make sense. They would be opening up a bridge that they can't sink, that people can just shove hundreds of tanks over and initiate a counteroffensive. It would make no sense to retreat from Novokakhovka. Just like it would make no sense to use T-34s in combat, because the things were made almost 100 years ago. They were designed. We're reaching there, and it just doesn't make sense to use them. So yeah, that's my 2 cents with that.
Totally agree. Always appreciate your input, Allrock. Glad to see you back. Aaron, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. How you doing, guys? So certainly I will say yes. I mean, the T-54s, T-55s they're moving in Russia. We don't know if they're going to be going to Ukraine, but I agree with Allrock. They're probably going to be, to put those against, in front lines. I mean, you could maybe use them. They'd be useful in, say, in urban combat operations, sure, but they lack adequate armor. They lack. They're outclassed by, in any case, they're outclassed by most even armored vehicles. I mean, we're talking about stuff, in the 50s that have been fielded, and many thousands have been fielded. But you could potentially, put 50 caliber slap rounds through the top of the turrets. I mean, it's thin on the top, and they've got a 100 millimeter gun, which is not bad, but I mean, a BMP3, has a 100 millimeter gun, right? So these things are, yeah, they're outclassed, they're out of date. They would be good as, if they're making an assault, short-term assaults or stationary fire support. Okay, I mean, if they've got the rounds left of them. Another thing I'm hearing about is that the Russians are coming out with, it looks like their main tank plan, Zheva Gavangovad. Yeah, I butchered that name, but they're coming out with a remote-controlled BMP3. What I'm hearing about, I mean, whether they can produce a lot of them, we don't know. I mean, we don't think so, but it's like, again, I never want to underestimate the Russians, and so this has always been one of these things that it comes into play. Like, yeah, they can produce some nice, semi-nice looking stuff, but does it work? It still has the Achilles heel of the ammunition stored in the carousel underneath the turret. So there's all kind of just it looks better, but it actually is, some of those machines are not as reliable even as like a BMP2, the old venerable BMP2, which is quite, it's quite a good vehicle in comparison even to the BMP1, which is too lightly armored. But again, those who don't know me, I'm Aaron Boma, host of the Bauma Report, military analyst, military historian, and autism advocate. And yeah, it was great having you up last night, Michael, and I'm glad I could make it tonight.
Well, thanks for joining us, Aaron. Appreciate your comments. All Rock, your hand's gone up. Did you want to reply to any of that?
Yeah, I would disagree in the T-55's ability to be useful and in any kind of direct action use. The best, so in an urban environment, it's going to be incredibly vulnerable to every single anti-tank weapon that Crane has, not just like modern ATGM or modern portable anti-tank weapons, but you're talking being vulnerable to anti-tank grenades or being vulnerable to an RPG-7. The T-55 is not made, or is not, what I wouldn't say is not made, because it was made to do these things, but the problem is it's been a few years and we've increased in capability. In a static defensive position, it's even worse because then it doesn't move. So it can be taken out by artillery. Even a close artillery round will pretty mess up a T-55. If you're going into like even supporting actions, it's going to be a liability, because you're not only going to look after the fact isn't going to be effective, because the thing isn't going to be effective as well. It doesn't have an auto loader. It has there's a manual loader in a T-55. This was before they made auto loaders, and they will have problems maintaining it. We only suspect they have around 500 operational T-55s in their war reserve, out of the thousands that they put in there, because it's been so long. It was in the 80s that they took it out, and they haven't manufactured the ammunition in Russia since 86 or 89. Iran manufactures some of 100 millimeter, but they mostly manufacture HE for their artillery. So that's why I'm saying if it is used in any capacity, it will be used as a self-propelled gun. if it's used in any other capacity, it won't be made for it. It won't do well. It won't do good. It will be a liability, because if you have one that's been in storage for 40 years, it was made 80 years ago, and it comes out of storage, and you get 3 of these things, right? And you're told to attack a position. Well, one of them is probably going to break down before you even get there. Another's going to break down in the middle of a fight, and the other one's going to get blown up by Joe Blow in his emplaced like position with anything. I don't think a 50 cal can pin it from the top with a slap round. They'd have to go through 200 millimeters of armor. The T55 has a curved turret, so its top isn't as vulnerable as modern MBTs. It's still vulnerable, but it isn't as vulnerable. The problem again with the T55 is mostly maintenance. Most of them are going to break down before they even get to the front. Half of them are going to break down in the middle of the fight. The other half of them are going to go meet a law. It's not going to be a good way for any Russians. The only thing that would happen would be more Russian tankers would die.
So two points inspired by what Allrock just said.
If I could
One
go
is,
after, comment on after.
one is that interestingly, talking about whether the T55 armor can defend against a 50 round with, I think you said, slap armor. To that end, Wolverine has been sharing, and we put up in Aaron's space last night. He actually found a cross section of their armor, which is kind of cool. So if I find that photo, I can put it up just for novelty. Also, Allrock, you're speaking about a small fraction of the T55s that are in storage are believed to be, serviceable or restorable. To the extent that there was the one photo of T55s in transit, there was another video that was going around of them on a train being moved. But then I saw one reputable account note that video of them in transit on a train was actually almost a decade old. And in fact, it was apparently a train load that was being sent to a decommissioning plant. So that just goes to show that they've gradually been, whittling down the numbers of those, even from storage, over the last decade. Aaron, yeah, they have. Aaron, feel free to come back in. Maybe we won't get too deep into the weeds. There will be more discussion of tanks sort of down the agenda, but go ahead for now.
Okay, I just, just to comment on, now maybe I was exaggerating about the slap rounds, but we were talking about that in last night. And yeah, you're right, Allrock, when it's, of course, if they could be, what I meant is they could be useful. They're going to try to use them, but they're going to be easily destroyed. Yes, I mean, light anti-tank rockets, M72 laws, which are developed in the 60s, are designed to take those things out. I mean, and they're still used by, people, a lot of countries still have them and use them. And those unguided throwaway rockets are, I mean, these things can be, they're good for today. Like they're good for bunkers that do propose, like, small bunkers and whatnot, pillboxes. But these things could, I mean, they have the anti-armor weapons that they have. The Ukrainians have the NLAWs and the Javelins, and then they've got RPG-7s, lots of those. Those are more than enough capable of taking out a T-55. I mean, those are, if it's not one round, then 2 rounds. I mean, and nothing is most tanks are dead after certainly just one Javelin. I mean, so yeah, I was referring to, yes, they can use them. Will it be useful? Maybe. Could they, if they use them in urban combat, that they can try, and it might be useful for a while, but they're going to be easily destroyed. That's what I was referring to.
Okay, thanks, guys. There are some articles about recent transfers, both of tanks and planes, to Ukraine in just a few minutes. So we'll happily take your input on hardware when we get down to that. Before going to the next hand, just 2 more items in the nest I wanted to highlight. One that's interesting I often like to find profiles where sort of established institutions are speaking to OSINT. Last week, we saw that in the UK integrated review, they talked about increasing reliance on OSINT. This week, it's the second item in the nest. It's a tweet by the US Naval Institute. And they note that OSINT has had a dramatic effect in Ukraine, and it may actually, have a significant effect on any future U.S. war as well. So you might be interested in that article. One other item I had included in the good OSINT examples that you guys might like paying attention to. It's early on, but it's the tweet by Cameron up in the nest, who is a regular in our spaces. And every so often people have brought up questions about, well, what are the ammo suppliers? In particular, there was an article, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal this week about how there was actually a shortage of powders, for artillery ammo. And so Cameron is pretty detail oriented, and he's begun a process of looking at the companies that are involved in the manufacture of ammunition in the countries that back Ukraine. And so he's just collecting sort of company names at this point, but I understand he's hoping to build out a more detailed understanding of that manufacturing environment. Based on conversations we've had about it in the space, if you're the sort of person who likes digging into this, I suspect he might be open to help in that effort. So, maybe shoot Cameron a message if you'd like to contribute to his research a bit. Before moving on to the other conversation topics, John is a speaker, and he shot me a message about sort of background philosophy of OSINT that he wanted to ask. So we'll go to his question, and if anybody has comments on it, we can maybe have a back and forth, and then we'll move on to the rest of the agenda. John, go ahead.
Yes, wonderful. Actually, I wanted to parlay right on to what you're talking about, how OSINT has had an impact on the war in Ukraine, and I couldn't help but wonder the amount of human intelligence that's available through Twitter and, Telegram and a dozen other accounts. And that's kind of where I'm getting at with, it seems like OSINT is a human intelligence gathering community. And speaking to that, my question is how, the notable errors of like the Canadian-Ukrainian volunteer, as I'm sure most of us are familiar with, and then now this James Vasquez saga has impacted how OSINT scrutinizes the way they endorse and because I think it's, like I said, a peer-to-peer community through OSINT, and how this has maybe transformed how the OSINT community is going to reevaluate their way of approaching this. And a part two of it, how much this maybe has damaged the public image in the immediate, if not for the Canadian Ukrainians so much, but maybe more so with James Vasquez, because I can imagine everyone in this room right now could name a half a dozen troll accounts that have been dancing, celebrating some of the stuff in the past 24 or give or take hours. And at that, I would like to hand it back to you guys, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, it's a valid question. I'll admit that I didn't follow Mr. Vasquez very closely, other than to see that he would occasionally speak in spaces. Those who have attended my spaces regularly know that I take a lot more technical approach to things, and that I heavily rely on the nest, and that's because I want to be sourcing everything that I'm talking about, because to be honest, you shouldn't believe me, right? You should believe my sources. And maybe the term OSINT has come to be regarded by the public as a little overly broad, in that if somebody is on the ground in Ukraine and they're speaking about their personal experiences, you know, that has value, but that's a different thing than, you, you know, doing a statistical analysis or, you know, very meticulously sourcing several pieces of background information and, you know, splicing them together. And so, you know, I just don't know that I ever would have included either the Canadian Ukrainian volunteer or Mr. Vasquez in the OSINT label, even if they are a little bit more broadly. And so my reaction is more to say, just be careful who you know, follow your information from and look for sourcing. We've had similar conversations in these spaces over the last few months about how do you tell who's a good analyst? How do you put out a good product? I have a tweet I always like to go back to. I wrote a few months ago about steps that move you from being an aggregator to actually an analyst. If I can dig that up, I'll put it in the nest. But those are my thoughts. If anybody else would like to speak to it, you're welcome to. We might not have anybody up to speak to it now, but keep it in mind and we can come back to it. Wolverine, go ahead.
So the thing I wanted to say is he mentioned OSINT and human. So
just to interrupt, movie or something playing in the background, if you can, if you have control over the ability to mute that, we'd be able to hear you.
Hold on a second. God damn it. Sorry about that. All right. So human OSINT. Okay. The two terms of intelligence gathering are completely different and they do not deal with each other, because OSINT, anyone and their mother can do. Okay. A 5-year-old kid who's who's on his computer can do OSINT. Anybody can go do OSINT. The biggest thing is that just because you say something or find something, you need to back it up via other OSINT sources to validify what it is. Okay, human is completely different. No one in the space. I mean, well, I did when I was in the military. We did some of the stuff with the human guys, but all of us who are in here, we will never do human stuff because that involves you as an individual going out to those areas where there may be bad guys, good guys, whoever it is, talking with the locals and getting the information directly from them. So you cannot sit there and say OSINT and human are related, because they're not, because they're completely different sources of where you're getting your data and your information from. And even if you still do human, okay, yeah, you may say, hey, this guy said there's all these tanks over here, right? But you just can't go off of that just because of what an individual. You have to look it up. You can back that up by, like, is this like, hey, we didn't know there was armor over here. Okay, you can get via another human source, or you can get via UAVs, satellite imagery, and all that stuff, and say, okay, hey, we had no idea. This guy gave us a tip, said, hey, I saw armor over here, and the military unit would sit there and validate, okay, yeah, we've actually validated, yeah, this information is good because we've seen it over thermal or whatever it means. OSINT and human are not related. That's why when you go into the military side, human is its own complete MOS. The OSINT is taught across the board, because especially on the intel analyst side, because they can sit there and they have time to where they can sit there and validate, oh, hey, we saw this, and it's different stuff like that. So you cannot put that human and OSINT are the same thing. That's like next to impossible.
Okay, it's interesting you explaining how it's done via MOS. We've had a couple of guests on who, maybe they're not engaging in exactly, human in the way that you would if you were in military intelligence, but we have talked to a few people who have gone through the transition whereby they start gathering information just from open sources, but they become they build a name for themselves and they become reliable. And then some of those who follow them, who have firsthand reports, then start, giving them updates directly, and they start to bridge that gap from just analyzing information from open sources to taking firsthand accounts and being the ones to make them open in the first instance. And I'm not sure what terminology we should use for that, but it seems like that's a path that several of the people we've spoken to have followed. Did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, so technically that is still OSINT. Human is this, okay? These are MOS trained guys. This is not something that civilian guys go to. This is where, and what my basic job was, I provided the security for the human teams. We would secure the area. We had to clear the buildings and do all that stuff for the human guys. Now, once the human guys go in there, so the human guys, and this is actually where it was actually when I used to work with them, I learned a lot of cool stuff from these guys. But these with the human guys, they're basically they're like police detectives or investigators for the intel side, because they have to go into a structure and say, okay, we had information there was, whether it be IED making material, weapons, stuff like that. Us as the infantry, we go in. So, when you want to compare it, like for civilian terms, us going the infantry would be like, when you have your civilian police, right? Your civilian police, the SWAT guys, they go in, they clear the whole building. And then who comes in and actually does that? You have your investigators, and then your, oh crap, what do they call those guys now? The guys who collect up all the specimens, data, CSI guys, those guys, in conjunction with them, right? And so we do the same thing. Us infantry types, or you can use MPs also, but us infantry types, we go in, we secure not only the whole village, we also secure specific structures. Once we say, okay, hey, the structure is clear, it's safe, then they'll have one guy go in, one or two guys who are the human guys, they'll start going through the whole structure, checking all of this stuff. Now, while that's going on, the human will have another person who may be proficient in the language, or they're not proficient in the language, they'll have a translator with them, and they're going to start going through. And their job as the human guys in that portion is kind of like, like a B cop, right? He goes to an area, he says, hey, I know how things normally are here. I'm used to how everything operates and stuff like that. And he can walk into her and say, okay, hey, something's off here, something's different here. Well, the human guys can do kind of the same thing. They go up with the translator, or they speak the language, and they sit there and go, okay, something's not right here. What's different? And through the translator, they'll start talking to people who will talk with them. And sometimes that's why they use a lot of females of that, because a lot of this is especially proved in Iraq, is that a lot of the Iraqi women would not talk to human personnel if they're males. But females, they opened up all the time. So that was a big thing that they would do, and that helped that. So, the human guys, or like you said, it's anything dealing with me or you or anybody in this space, if they go out and say, hey, I found this news article, or where they get it off of Telegram, where they get it off of TikTok, where they get it off of Facebook, YouTube, and stuff like that, that's OSINT, and, even if it goes like, let's say with you, Michael, let's say you tell me, hey, I saw a train load of T-55s coming from Russia, right? Okay, cool. Well, guess what? You show me something that was an OSINT source, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back around and say, okay, well, we have this one source that Michael provided to me. What other sources do we have where I can sit there and validate that, okay, yeah, all these tanks are still being shipped into Ukraine. That is all still OSINT. It's not human.
Okay, I appreciate your experience and your background on that. So thanks very much. These conversations are just helpful sometimes for people to be trying to draw categorizations sort of in the back of their mind. John, if you want to come back in, maybe fairly briefly, we'll wrap up this topic.
Yes, I just wanted to quickly respond how the human intelligence aspect is any fundamentally different when you're looking at a source that is claiming something, that source is being followed by Rob Lee or by any other of the more, I don't know, study of war accounts, a credibility that the perspective that you get from that, the credibility is not influenced, how that's not the same equivalent of you going and talking to that person in your the tribe who's telling you about a secondhand source. It might be a human intelligence, but it's relating on the credibility of somebody you can, or you believe you can trust. And I think this is just an electronic equivalent thereof. Maybe human intelligence was a trigger word, and I didn't mean to offend you in that, so maybe I could have used a better word. But I'm simply implying when you see a source that's being followed by one of these I don't know, leading sources that are not, I don't know, off base on these issues, it seems that they lead more credibility in terms of the weight and their claims they make, if that makes sense.
Do you mind if I respond real quick, Michael?
Sure. Maybe both your comment and Alrock, if we go around, maybe if you can keep it to 30 seconds to a minute, that would be great.
Okay, yeah. So the thing is, this is Arlie, great work. I love what the guy does. But the thing is, this is Arlie is not on the ground. He's not over there talking to the people who are involved in the direct combat and or the civilians who may be in those areas. And that's what the difference is. Okay. Rob Lee, he's searching whatever he's doing. It's awesome. I love his work. But he's pulling it from different OSINT sources still. And that's where the fine difference is that Rob Lee is not on the ground talking to Ukrainians, DNR, LNR, and stuff like that. The Ukrainians have that. And that's what the huge difference is.
Sure. I mean, not to undercut your point, but Rob Lee and Michael Kaufman and so on, they traveled to Ukraine for a week about a week ago, and they were in Bakhmut and speaking with commanders on the ground. So it strikes me some of these people are doing a mix, but I totally take your point. It's not.
Yeah, no, that I didn't realize that, but yeah, if they are sitting there, yeah, then yes, that would actually be human. But a lot of the stuff when he's like the videos and all that is OSINT.
I agree. So I think we're gonna go to Alrock, then we're gonna wrap this point, just because I do want to get to a few other things. Go ahead, Alrock.
Yeah, I was just gonna that's your doing all that stuff, and then you have your human, which is your spy people, and your other people. I'm using general terms here, and they get it from that. OSINT is not in any way like a human sort of thing or SIGINT sort of thing. 90% of it's looking at news articles or things on Telegram or social media and other, and putting it together into a coalesced picture. You don't have that in other intelligence because that's not how they operate. It's a much higher level. And yes, if you get something from like human or SIGINT or even OSINT or whatever, you generally try to back that up with other sources so that you get everything together into a more coalesced whole. That way you can back up what you're saying. So it really is where the source of the information is from and how it's obtained. And nobody who's doing OSINT is really doing human unless they're actually doing human or SIGINT, which is very rare.
Yeah, I agree. It's rare. Although, interestingly, the sorts of folks
I just wanted to bring up that, of course.
So we're going to keep going with hands. It is interesting that a lot of the folks that we have come through our space are among that rare few who do sometimes engage in signals intelligence or human intelligence in a way that crosses over the boundaries. So maybe it contributes to the blurring of the categorization that people just refer to them as OSINT because 80%, 90% of what they do is that, but it is helpful to understand that there are all these different sources. So Aaron, I'll let you come in, but if you can make it brief, I would like to move on. And Aaron, if you'd like to come in, you may be muted, so you'll have to unmute.
I think there's an audio problem there, Michael. You might want to give Aaron a minute and move on to another topic possibly, and then he can come back.
Yep, so I will just move on. Just on the agenda, I next wanted to chat about some developments I'm calling this the broad overview, just an update on topics we've discussed in the space before, and there are 4 or 5 subjects here I wanted to run through. The first was developments in connection with TikTok. So we had discussed risks associated with TikTok previously, including the fact that it has been banned in several contexts in Western countries, including U.S. Department of Defense applications. I believe the European Union staff members. It's been banned in Canada, both for the Department of Defense and several government functions. And then there was a big hearing on TikTok today in the United States. And so just a few items to run through. If you check out the Nest, there were overviews of how that hearing went. And the general consensus is that the hearing went terribly. This first tweet by Peter Hamby, there are others in his thread talking about how the hearing was an abject disaster. He's noting that he believes it was a miscalculation on their part to come into the hearing and start out by bragging about how deeply enmeshed the app was in American society. There was a notable sort of misstep or faux pas. This is noted in the second tweet from Patrick Fox, where the CEO was testifying, and he was asked whether TikTok is a threat to national security and if the software spies on US users. And his response began with, well, I don't think that spying is the right way to describe it. And you would think that coming into a congressional hearing, you would want to be able to definitively say, does your app spy on Americans? To say, no, here is what our app does. But that's not the way they approached it. And so I'm anticipating that this will not win them, very much goodwill, to the extent that there is this new Congressional Committee on Strategic Competition with China that's proposing new legislation, which would include legislative power to restrict the use of TikTok. So I think we have more restrictions to anticipate in the near future. If you wanted more background on this subject, the third item in the Nest is an article from this morning from the New York Times that goes through the background on efforts to restrict TikTok in the United States. There's also a tweet up there from John Scott Railton, who is a leader at Citizen Lab. And he's noting that in TikTok's congressional testimony, they used a study that Citizen Lab did on TikTok, but they were misinterpreting it, almost billing it as if it was a seal of approval. And Citizen Lab therefore came out and said, well, we don't give out seals of approval, and if we did, TikTok would not get one. And I thought that was, a notable slapdown from an organization that generally is fairly neutral in its billing. That's just the update on TikTok. If anybody has thoughts, you're welcome to raise points. We've been joined by Aaron again. Aaron, would you like to go ahead quickly, and then we'll keep going?
Yeah, sorry. I don't know. I couldn't hear you, and I didn't realize you were talking or somebody else was talking. Sorry about that. So I put in the Nest ways back just an example of Rob Lee's work. Rob has some interesting stuff, all very good work, but it showcases that some of the technical aspects of the Wagner Group, which the Wagner Group has been known to have a lot of high quality 5.56 rifles, as 5.56, anywhere from all kind of different AR platforms. You can see there they've got one of the 5.56 sniper rifles that they are using there, so that they are. I wanted to send that. I was hoping OPSEC would be here, but that's just some photos of the kitted out Wagner groups.
Okay, thanks, Aaron, for that. So the next item I wanted to move on and discuss were developments in the accession of Finland to NATO. But before I do that, I see you had your hand up. Did you want to come in on something?
I just was wondering, in some of those, I hadn't had a chance to read them. Had you seen any information about how the US would propose to essentially remove TikTok going forward?
Well, what I saw wasn't a proposal to remove TikTok. In our discussion about this, maybe about 2 weeks ago, we got into the details a little bit about how the Trump administration attempted to use an executive order to restrict the user base of TikTok. But I'm not sure by what legal means that executive order was rescinded or found not to be valid, but there are freedom of speech concerns around preventing its use in general, which is why the existing bans that have been put in place are in organizations that are government organizations, the Department of Defense, and certain congressional groups that aren't allowed to use TikTok anymore. My understanding is that one of the laws being considered by this strategic competition congressional committee would restrict the commercial ability of TikTok, with the result that it wouldn't be allowed to be distributed in the Google Play and Apple app stores anymore, meaning it would undermine their commercial viability, and that those who had it installed would theoretically be able to continue to use it, but they wouldn't be able to upgrade versions, meaning that it would be that much more open to competition from any new platforms. But I know that ID10T has some great points on these issues. Go ahead.
Thank you, Michael. Shot you a DM with this, with the Restrict Act, which I invite everyone to take a look at. There's not a precedence for singling an app out and saying, you're bad, go away. We still operate in a free country. So this Restrict Act comes at it with it's approaching the issue of national security concerns. So technologies outside of our borders or foreign threats can fall under this umbrella if this Restrict Act that was pushed by the Senate goes through. So there's quite a bit of nuance in how it needs to be approached because of the lack of precedence in technology and laws. Laws are respectively many years behind technology's growth.
That's a great point. I will put the link to the Restrict Act in the nest in just a moment. I just have to post it. We'll go Paul and then Aaron. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, I think Aaron was first, but I was just going to mention I just got a news bulletin on my iPad. The U.S. contractor was killed over in Syria, and we counterattacked the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. That's about it.
I'm sorry, when you say we, are you saying the United States has taken action against the IRGC?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay. All right. Well, that might be a matter that people listening are keen to go and investigate on their own as breaking news. Okay, we'll go Aaron and then ID10T again. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks. I just, what Paul, you were just talking I was just talking. Sorry, my thing is sticking. I put it in the nest. It's the airstrikes information there. So that's some of the breaking news there. I put out in from Bloomberg Middle East, and of course the rifle what I was talking about earlier from Rob Lee is some of the examples of 5.56 rifles and 7.62 times 51. So it's a lot of high tech Western chambered ammunition that Wagner is using, as far as that example there and others. So I put that in the nest as well, and then so in the Bloomberg, yeah, this is just the breaking news. U.S. carries out airstrikes against groups linked to Iran after a drone crashes into base, killing American contractor and wounding 5 service members.
Thanks very much. We always appreciate sources. Before moving on from the TikTok point, ID10T, did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just going to add that we scrambled F-16s out of Sigonella, Italy to Syria for that engagement.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Apologies for the sort of slowdown, but I'm posting things in the background as speakers are going ahead. And so that Restrict Act that ID10T referred to as being potentially applicable to TikTok, it's now in the nest for those who would like to have a look at it. Okay, just next update on the NATO accession or the Finnish accession to NATO, which is moving along at a fair clip. It's been moved back in the nest a little bit, but starting the 4th item back. There's a post there from Mika, who's a regular in our spaces, who is, I believe, Finnish himself, who did a nice summary. And he noted that the proposal for approval of accession is going to be submitted to the Turkish General Assembly on Friday or Saturday, and that Hungary's vote on the same matter is scheduled for Monday. So FYI, that's the timing for approval there. The next item back in the nest is a tweet from the Finnish government. It's the photo of the Finnish president signing the paperwork. So all of the legal work is now done in Finland, meaning that if Turkey approves in the next 2 days and then Hungary approves on Monday, Finland will now be a member of NATO. The last I had heard, because it's related, of course, the last I had heard about Swedish accession is that there will be changes to a Swedish anti-terrorism law that will take effect on the 1st of June, and that apparently Turkey has said they intend to wait to see those changes take effect, as they believe they're related to promises made to them. There was a memorandum of understanding signed, and apparently they're saying it relates to items from that memorandum. Now, of course, that timeline might be affected if the Turkish election on May 14th results in a change of government, but we're unlikely to see much movement on Swedish accession before the middle of May. Wolverine, go ahead.
So I know this is kind of a little late. I was just replying to Aaron's thing. So that MTS 566 is a 308 AR platform based on the AR-10 with a 24-inch barrel.
Yes, that's right.
It says it has a grouping of one MOA at 100 yards. But the thing is, this is why I would not trust that rifle, is because they don't have the ballistics that like what our rounds is. We've been using that for years. It's a round that we've developed for what we need to do for sniping. So I don't think that their rifle would do as well. Like example, let's say our M24s or the M40A5 and or A6s that are chambered in 308.
I agree with you because it's Western chambered, but it's Russian made. So I mean, like they can say all they want. The brochures can say 1 MOA, but well, yeah.
Okay, guys, we're gonna keep on track. I wanted to make 1 or 2 more points on Finland. So while the Finnish president has approved the session and the schedule is set out for approval by Monday from the other countries, there was another development today. It's now 5 or 6 items back in the nest. I'll move it to the front just so you guys don't have to scroll. It's a tweet by Solonius Pasternak, who he's just putting up an article from a Finnish newspaper that's highlighting Finland announced that they will now be undertaking reconnaissance surveillance flights jointly with NATO. Or excuse me, at this point, it looks like it's jointly with the US, likely in anticipation of their accession to NATO. And it doesn't say it here, but I saw many posts go up today from those in and around Finland saying this is a huge deal because Finland has been very protective. It has never allowed these kind of joint flights. And then interestingly, I'm just going to move it to the front as well. In just a moment, it should populate a tweet from the Lookout, which actually shows a flight track of one of the first U.S., I believe he said it was an RC-135, flying over Finland for the first time. So that's a significant development. Zodiac, go ahead.
All right, thank you. So definitely a significant development. And shows the NATO integration already beginning to happen with Finland. I also shared a tweet there. It's now, I believe, 3rd in the nest. There has now been an agreement signed between the heads of the air forces of Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway to jointly combine their fighter forces. So essentially we have one giant Viking fighter air force now of 250 plus strong aircraft, and they're all going to operate as one joint force, which will allow greater coordination, potentially sharing of logistics as well as bases, which primarily will be a force made up of F-35As, as well as Swedish Griffins, which will be interesting to keep an eye on.
That is interesting. So I am just populating the nest for the next topic, which is some initial signs or comments in connection with a potential Ukrainian offensive. So I'm just putting those up now, and then I will speak to them as they populate. So the first, which should populate in just a moment, is a video that was put up by the head of Russia's Wagner private military corporation, Prigozhin, speaking about his view of the Ukrainian offensive. So he is saying, now, of course, who knows what the accuracy of this is, but it is worth considering to see what the Russian view of it may be, regardless of its accuracy about what is likely to happen. And so he is suggesting that Ukraine has concentrated 200,000 reserves in the Donbass, with 80,000 being near Bakhmut, and suggesting that he believes, and again, I'm not saying this is likely, but he believes there may also be an incursion into the Belgorod region in Russia that would then be used as an exchange for territories in the Donbass that may be harder to liberate. And then he believes that liberation of Crimea would come at the end. So for what it's worth, that is Prigozhin's view of the potential.
So I was looking at that when you look at the uptake in Belgrade, trying to do an incursion to Belgrade, I think that would actually be more counterproductive because, there are still, a lot of Russian citizens who, agree with the war, and there's also a lot they don't. But the second that you see Ukrainian troops crossing in the border into Russia, that's going to change. You know, anybody who had maybe been hard line, oh, you know, we're against this war and stuff like that. You know, when they see foreign troops invading on their territory, that's a whole different thing. You know, it's this. We're going to see a lot of the people reacting kind of like how the Ukrainians were, and it's not going to be in the best interest for the Ukrainians to actually try and to go to Belgrade, because, you know, it just doesn't help. And the other thing is if they do go into Belgrade, well, that actually limits weapon systems that they can use. So any of the Western supplied munitions or weapons, weapon systems, stuff like that, they won't be able to use for a operation like that. They could only rely on their own organic weapon systems that they had prior to this invasion, you know. So their 152s, 122s, the Guragans, Smerches, and Grads, and all that stuff. So I think that would be, you know, the other thing is there's a very good chance they could turn a lot of the public opinion. Excuse me, sorry. They could turn the public opinion against the Ukrainians by them actually invading another sovereign country. So, you know, it's one thing when you're invaded and you're fighting them and kicking the piss out of them on your own terms and grounds. But when you sit there and then you basically do what the bad guys are doing, you cross into their territory, you're basically doing the same thing that they're doing, right? And even though that they may have superior forces, the best example was that I've seen something like that where the locals will actually resist is when we invaded Iraq in 2003. We were informed by General Mattis that the first Iraqi army unit that we were going to hit was the 51st Mech Infantry in the Basra area. And General Mattis sent a message to them, say, hey, we don't want to destroy you, we don't kill you, but, you know, you can either surrender, capitulate, or we'll destroy you, you know, for lack of better terms. Well, they didn't reply back, or they, you know, said no. So what happened is when we went in there, these units were using T-55s, T-62s, MTLBs, a lot of the older equipment, because they're farther from Baghdad, but they fought harder. Why did they fight harder? Because there is a foreign force invading their country. They didn't really give a crap about Saddam Hussein. Maybe the higher ups did, but the thing is that the 51st Mech Infantry Division was fighting against an enemy force that was purposely invading their sovereign country. You know, if the Mexican army did that to us, we do the same thing. So that's why I don't think that would be beneficial for Ukraine to do something like going into Belgrade. And, you know, the other thing I saw where it said, like, you know, them hiding 200,000 troops. Well, they've done it before when they did the offensive into Kharkiv and into Kherson. You know, a lot of the Russian forces and all us, a lot of the OSINT committee were like, holy crap, where did this come from? Because they hit all those units and no one knew about it.
So I agree with you on the idea of them crossing into Belgorod. I was just putting up Prigozhin's perspective because it's interesting to see whether it might be characteristic of the broader Russian approach. Related to that, for example, I've now put in the nest a thread by Chris O, where he's noting that the Kursk region, it has released a budget where it's announced that it's going to spend $42 million building border fortifications. And apparently that amount, which is intended to be spent over the next 3 to 4 months, is something like 1/3 of the regional health budget. So that's like a huge amount of money relative to what their government budget is. And so even if it is for show, either they're taking it semi-seriously or they really want to commit to the the idea of it. Zodiac, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you, Wolverine. And I think to just add to what you were saying, I think this is just Prigozhin trying to play to the heartstrings of domestic politics, being like, oh yeah, if we don't get more reinforcements, more ammo or whatever, the Ukrainians are just going to invade Belgorod and it's going to get ugly and yada, 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 yada. I agree. The Ukrainians aren't going to jump into Russian land. There may be a time when that conversation might have to happen, i.e. what if Russia doesn't give up after Ukraine takes back all its land and keeps fighting? Then, that conversation is going to have to be had. But at this point, I agree with you. It's counterproductive for the Russians, or correction, the Ukrainians, to do incursions with actual full mechanized forces into Russian territory. Special forces raids, yeah, sure, but full mechanized forces crossing the border, yeah, no, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And to talk about the point about Ukrainian forces just popping out of nowhere, I've been getting updates from Janes fairly regularly now for the past 4.5, 5 months, and Russia has lost the deep battle space completely. They have been not striking into the deep battle space. They have no ISAR in the deep battle space into the Ukrainian lines. They have no idea what is going on, past the FIBA in Ukraine. So Ukrainians could be building up anywhere and Russia doesn't know. So this is why they're getting caught off by surprise now, because they have no concept of the deep battle right now. And their tactical commanders and the strategic commanders are not talking to each other. So they might be running like a random ISAR flight and then it's not benefiting the troops on the ground. So they're not even communicating properly to execute proper effective offensive operations, and it's showing very quickly here.
To back your point up, it's interesting. I saw this tweet. It's in the nest now, by Tom Bullock. He also notes that Russia doesn't have ISTAR, and he suggests that's why they are striking civilian infrastructure as opposed to targeting military assets. Is just they can't track it. And his tweet came to mind as well because he was formerly employed by Janes. So it's just funny that you should refer to Janes and then also make the point about ISTAR, because I don't think he would have written those updates. But in any event, go ahead, Mr. Trilobite.
Yeah, for me, I think the one occasion where a Ukrainian, large Ukrainian incursion into Russian territory would be realistic is if they thought they could land like a truly decisive blow against them to the point where like international response and domestic Russian response would be lesser than what they would gain from that sort of decisive action. But I can't really think of a scenario where where the gains would be that substantial.
I agree with you. Rolling along, a few more points on a potential Ukrainian offensive. It's now the fourth item back in the nest. It's a tweet by Oliver Carroll, who writes for The Economist. He's noting it's a Telegram post by General Syrskyi, who is in charge in the area around Bakhmut for the Ukrainians, who is in his post was noting that the Russian forces around Bakhmut are becoming exhausted, and that he is, quote, or that the Ukrainians are, quote, very soon going to take advantage of that. So we're all anticipating it's coming, but actually having Ukrainian staff saying the same thing, just reinforces it. Two more points. Medusa, there's an article, it's the fifth back in the nest. Medusa is tracking what's happening on the ground, and they noted in their update yesterday what they believe are probing attacks by the Ukrainians that may indicate the very first sort of recon. I don't know if recon and force is the right word, by the Ukrainians on the ground in some new regions. So that struck my radar and is worth following. One more point before going to hands. It's the sixth item back post. It's a tweet by the Washington Post in connection with that Prigozhin suggestion about crossing of Belgorod, the Washington Post put together an interesting graphic that shows strikes and raids across the border into Russia, consolidated into one graphic. So I found that very interesting. I'm sorry, I didn't see hand order. I'm going to go with Mr. Trilobite and then Wolverine. Go ahead, Trilobite.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that oh crap, I forgot what I was going to say. No, never mind. You go, Wolverine.
Okay, go ahead, Wolverine.
So, in regards to Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Volodar, so because of the failing of the operations that have been happening down in Volodar with the losses that the Russian side has been experiencing with their naval infantry units, specifically the 155th and the 40th, some of the stuff I've been reading over the past couple of days from ISW looks like they're basically pulling units from the Volodar area and shifting them over up towards the Avdiivka area. And what it looks like what they're trying to do is they're trying to do with Avdiivka with what they're trying to do with Bakhmut. And there is a unit, it was either the 28th or the 136th Motorized Rifle Division that they mentioned that is still just kind of hanging there. It's not specifically engaged anywhere, but even if they were trying to introduce that unit into either Bakhmut or the Avdiivka area, the different brigades split up, they might not even be able to provide a substantial difference in how things are going. So what's telling me is that even if they're they say, okay, we got this division, we're going to split up, and send up like 2 brigades here, 2 brigades here. Well, a brigade, that's a couple thousand, let's say it's 5,000 troops. Okay. That's a substantial number. And if they're saying, oh no, that's not going to be enough, then that means that the Ukrainians actually probably have a lot more hardware and troops than what we're actually seeing in those areas. Now, I have heard, I know that by the Bakhmut area, currently the Ukrainian forces were doing counterattacks along the T-0504, trying to take some of the pressure off of there so they run their probably supplies and stuff like that. But as we see with Wagner and the Russian units in Bakhmut, their progress literally it's meters a day, trying to take Bakhmut because of the fierce resistance that they're experiencing from the Ukrainian units that are down there. And if they try and do the same thing in the Avdiivka area, it sounds like there are significant amount of Ukrainian forces there to basically be able to sap the Russian forces of manpower, logistics, and equipment in that area too. So when you have all that, that just goes to showing if the Russians, even if they commit all those units there, and it's not going to make a difference, you have to now look at it as like, okay, how many troops do the Ukrainians actually have in those areas? Because right now they're doing major offenses. Well, not major offenses, but they're doing major combat operations in Volodar, which is kind of dying down, Avdiivka, and around Donetsk city, Bakhmut, and then they're still doing all along the Kremina, Savato. I think they call them the Kremina, Savato, Kupiansk line now, even though it's still quite a ways off. So if the Ukrainians are still beating back or holding these, Russian forces in all those different areas, it makes you wonder, it's like, what's the amount of combat power that the Ukrainians are actually able to bring to bear in these areas against the force that's supposed to have a 2-to-1 ratio over them, when the kill ratio is actually, like 1 Ukrainian to every, I think it was now 3 to 5 Russians.
You make some great points there, and I think that those ratios are what have been quoted, although I've also seen some, like Rob Lee and those folks who have visited the ground, who say those ratios might be a little exaggerated. We will go to Trilobite and then Zodiac, and just by way of FYI to the audience, I normally like to run these spaces for about 3 hours. There's still a lot of content I'd hope to touch on, even just in the updates. I'm inclined to keep running for another 15 or 20 minutes. If any of my co-hosts have to go to focus on tracking ships for the Black Sea Grain Initiative or other general things, then I'll totally understand. Anyway, go ahead, Mr. Trilobite.
Yeah, I just wanted to really briefly say that the Ukrainians have definitely overperformed in their defensive Bakhmut. It seems like they've been able to halt the Russians from being able to close the noose around it completely. And I guess that just sort of plays into the reasoning of why they didn't choose to leave it, though the information that the people in this space had at the time definitely indicated that they should have done that. But if they're gonna naturally be operating on more info than we are, so I don't think that's too surprising.
Okay, thanks very much. Go ahead, Zodiac.
All right, thanks. So one thing we got to keep in mind too, when it comes to when we're looking at maps and we're throwing down, NATO map markers or whatever map markers you want for these units, whether they be brigades or divisions, is a lot of these units are being kept on the front and in place well longer than any Western army would consider leaving a force in place. Most Western armies at 10% casualties are considered combat ineffective and would pull a unit off the line. And when it comes to both the Ukrainians and the Russians, you're looking at units that are at 75, 70, 60, even for some Russian units, rumored down to as low as 40, 30% combat strength, and they're still being held on the front. So we do have to be careful when we're saying, oh, well, this division's here, this division's there, because it might not be an actual division or a brigade. It could easily be, half of that, which also plays into, are Russian combat operations actually stalling, or is it that these brigades are more like battalions getting smashed up against Ukrainian brigades or battalions when it says it's a division? We just don't know the accuracy of what the actual TOE and force composition is on either side in these different areas of the front. We can only make educated guesses based on combat footage we're seeing and everything else.
We will definitely take the numbers with a grain of salt. Certainly the 200,000 and 80,000 numbers were from Prigozhin, and so I'm not ascribing any particular value to them. But related to that idea, and I'm not sure if you had seen me put it in the nest and you were speaking to it in advance, 3 more little points with regard to a potential Ukrainian offensive, beginning with the 3rd item back in the nest. It's a tweet by militaryland.net. And they're the one source I've seen that has been doing good profiling of the development of new Ukrainian units, which I think is a very interesting topic. And they have actually just developed a new tool. It's a map that shows their understanding of Ukrainian tactical groupings. So you may be interested in checking that out. I understand that tracking Ukrainian units in this level of detail may have operational security implications. To the extent that I don't control military land, there's that. We'll have to see how they handle OPSEC in their map going forward, but for the time being, I think it's a useful tool. Following that in the nest, I'll just go to the 2 items and then I'll go back to hands. But following that in the nest, the 4th item, also by Military Land, they noted that a lieutenant colonel named Zabrodsky who formerly was the commander of the 95th Air Assault Brigade for the Ukrainians, which apparently, was a unit that did heavy service and acquitted itself well after the 2014 invasion. This lieutenant colonel had been out of service, and apparently he had I'm not sure if he was a member of parliament or he had some official role that he had left the military to take. He has now resigned that role, and he has been brought back into service and apparently is being appointed as the deputy commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which is obviously a significant role. And I wonder whether his rejoining at that senior level might have to do with, increased demand for senior officers in advance of an offensive. Last point is a tweet put up by Trent Telenko, who has some interesting insights from time to time. Occasionally he puts up some hot takes. I like this point that he put up the other day, which is that in the latest U.S. Military aid package, one thing that wasn't getting very much conversation was the inclusion of heavy fuel trucks. And so he set out a thread suggesting that these heavy fuel trucks might be very significant for an offensive, to the extent that if there are breakthroughs, having mobile heavy logistics vehicles will be very important to capitalizing on those breakthroughs quickly. So the thread is probably, worth your time. Wolverine, go ahead.
Interesting that Trent put up the fuel thing. They haven't done combat service support. So typically what happens is you do not push your refuelers up to the front at any time during offensive operations. What happens is there's a distribution process and how we do with the fuel and stuff like that. So example, let's say you have a tank battalion. They might have the capability to carry 25,000 gallons of fuel with them, right? But that fuel section will have like their own protection. They'll actually have tanks assigned to them, and when they go get their own fuel, they'll actually have tanks assigned to them sometimes to actually provide security for them to go get fuel. Now, those vehicles are going to also be back. Now, the thing is that what it does is that normally tanks have a specific range that they plan for, right? So typical range for a lot of for every combat vehicle in the United States is 300 miles. Now, it's going to fluctuate because engine idling and stuff like that. But what they do is they make it so that unit, that battalion, has its own so if their own amount of fuel, so they have to push forward, like they get an additional mission, or let's say they stay in place, they have the fuel that's actually going to be there. Now, the thing you actually got to look at is these tankers that they're sending. Where are they going to? Are they going to be actually attached to or given to a frontline combat unit, or are they going to be attached to like some type of combat service support battalion, where you would typically find all your bulk fuel carrying assets? So that's some of the things you got to look at, because if they're getting assigned to their combat service support battalions, what that means is they're setting up to have heavy trains of fuel, so that the units can do a dash back when they need to, pick up fuel, and then go back forward to refuel their tanks or whatever they have to continue on with their operations. So it gives the units a lot of flexibility of how they do with the fuel situation and how they're actually going to distribute the fuel to their combat units.
Thanks for that detail. Yeah, the way the Ukrainians handle that will be very interesting. And part of the reason I highlighted Trent's thread is just because I hadn't seen anybody else discussing the significance of those trucks. Now, how they're used operationally, I'm not sure, but I thought it was worth the conversation.
Well, it's sorry. And the one thing I want to say, if they're U.S. provided, the most common one that we use are the from the Army side, from Army stocks, the M978 HEMTT tankers, which are great trucks. They carry like 3,000 gallons of fuel, right? But if they are going for bigger fuel trucks, like the 5,000 gallon tankers, those typically are going to be a tractor trailer setup. So you may not want to get those as close. But if you get the Hemet tankers, the good thing about them is they actually have these awesome, great armor kits that actually will provide a lot of protection for the crew in the vehicle. They actually put this stuff on the tanks to actually protect them from, I know, small arms fire, I think. I don't know if it'll stop like shrapnel from artillery. But the other thing is what kind of tankers are they actually sending them to?
All good questions. Zodiac, go ahead. If you can be brief, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. I'll run this through quickly. But logistics of fuel trucks, as Wolverine pointed out, it could be Hemets or tractor trailers. Likely, though, more Hemets if they're going on the tactical end of things. The tractor trailers would be refueling the Hemets, because the Hemets are the ones that would be able to get closer to the front without risking of getting completely annihilated by small arms fire. And that it all works on a system of having 2K fuelers, 10K fuelers, and then further and further back getting heavier and heavier until you get to, like, say, a rail line and the giant fuel Bowsers that would be a rail car, and then slowly distributing that up to the units so that they can either do fixed in place replenishment, rolling replenishment, whatever the case may be.
Okay, well, thanks for that. As I'm putting these things up as indicators regarding how close is Ukraine getting to an offensive, what elements might they have, what equipment will they have available to them. I think we're seeing a lot of signs that they're getting close, and interesting new details about what will be available, which hopefully we'll get to in just a moment. So I think, all these great contributors like Wolverine and Zodiac, hopefully you guys keep coming by in the next couple of weeks when the offensive begins, so we can get a few answers to these questions that we have now. It looks like unfortunate that we lost. We had as a speaker our local Japanese correspondent, who I think had a question about the fact that the Japanese Prime Minister had attended or had visited Kiev unexpectedly, which was a significant development. We may not get to an in-depth discussion of the visit of Chinese President Xi to Russia, but I will note, since unfortunately we lost Toshi, that it was interesting that the Japanese Prime Minister should attend unexpectedly on the same day that the Chinese president was in Moscow, and that there may have been a bit of a designed, Asian influence to have those two countries be visiting the Ukraine and Russia respectively on the same day. The next item that's a follow-up on something we discussed on Sunday is continued reaction to the pressing of war crimes charges against Putin and one other. Her name is Pavlova, or something like that. I don't have it at my fingertips, but of course primarily Putin. So I'll run through these quickly. If they generate any questions or comments, feel free to jump in, but I'll try and run through them all before we go to any hands. The first is, on Sunday we discussed the fact that Putin's next big international trip would be to South Africa, and there was debate over whether South Africa might arrest Putin if he attended. And we're starting to get answers to that question from several countries. So Germany had immediately said, yes, we would arrest Putin if he came to Germany. Interestingly, up in the nest, as reported by Reuters, Hungary came out and said they would not arrest Putin. I saw a little bit of analysis of this saying that they hadn't put the necessary steps in place in their judicial system to act on warrants from the International Criminal Court, which sounds a lot like a cop-out and that it's a political position. But in any event, they're the one country who has said, nope, we would not arrest Putin. The next item in the nest, also Hungary, also being obstructionist, there was a European Union summit And there was an initiative. The EU wanted to put out a statement regarding the pressing of war crimes charges. And apparently a draft statement was prepared, and all of the other countries were ready to sign it jointly, but Hungary blocked it. And so the details are in that Bloomberg article in the Nest. However, in better news, several countries did come out and went the same route as Germany by saying, yep, we would absolutely arrest Putin. So Ireland came out and said that, and apparently South Africa also came out and said it, meaning that it's unlikely Putin will attend that BRICS summit in South Africa that I think had been scheduled for June. Moving along through the Nest, on the question of would you arrest, would you not arrest, the United States was asked that question, Secretary of State Blinken, and as we discussed on Sunday, the U.S. has a complicated relationship with the International Criminal Court, and so what Blinken dodged the question and said he didn't want to discuss it. He noted that the U.S. is not a party to the court, but then he essentially said, I find it extremely unlikely that Putin is going to come to the United States, so it's not really a material question anyway. So we, on a predictably complicated issue, we got a complicated answer. Moving further back in the Nest, two more points. These are more political tea reading. One, so these are both articles from Medusa. One is a conversation, reactions from insiders in the Kremlin who were speaking anonymously about the shock that they had when the war crimes charges were announced, and how there has been a bit of a rally around the flag effect, or a rally around the president, I should say, but that the anonymous sources are saying that it has resulted in greater polarization, and that a lot of people in and around the Kremlin are realizing that it's a stark move, meaning that there is no going back, and there is now fear that the closer you get personally to Putin, the more likely it is that additional war crimes charges will be laid, and that close association with Putin makes it more likely that you individually may be charged. So I found that an interesting report. I believe finally on the war crimes issue, yes, finally on the war crimes issue, is the fact that Russia has decided a good way to respond to this application of the war crimes charges is to in turn open a criminal investigation within Russia into ICC prosecutor Khan and ICC judges. I don't know how that is a wise political decision. It seems ridiculous, in terms of, you can't charge me, I charged you first. So we'll see what comes of that. Okay, I wanted to move on quickly. I know we're rapidly coming toward the end of even my extended time. I'll take maybe another 10 minutes. I just wanted to touch on a few weapons transfers items, because there were a few details that I'm not seeing get a lot of press. It will take me a minute to populate those into the Nest. While I do that, I'll just note that our next conversation will be this Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, or New York time. The invitation or reminder for that is now in the Nest, so please do set a reminder. We'd love you to come and join us then. We don't have our guests set yet, but we have some interesting folks that we're in discussions with, so I think it'll be a good conversation. I am just populating the Nest, so if you'll bear with me. So I wanted to touch on planes first, because we had developments on everything from MiGs to Su-25s to F-16 training, French Mirages, and even requests for Hornets. So I will drop these all in the nest. And then in case you guys have any insights, I'd love to hear them. Okay, they should all populate in the nest in just a moment. So of course, the first item to discuss is the fact that just today, Slovakia has now transferred 4 MiGs to Ukraine. And apparently the way that happened, it was posted by the Slovakian Ministry of Defense. I think I have that video as well on my profile here. They just had Ukrainian pilots come to Slovakia, get in the planes, and fly them away, which Russia had indicated. Yes, I do have it. So I'm putting that in the nest as well. Russia had indicated that if planes were flown from NATO countries to Ukraine, they would treat that as, you know, some sort of escalation or declaration of war, and that they would respond. But apparently they took no steps in response to the Ukrainian pilots flying them directly from Slovakia. And so these are the first 4. Slovakia will be giving Ukraine 13 of these, 10 of which are operational and 3 of which are parts donors planes. At the same time, Poland last week, while they have promised to provide MiGs as well, they haven't specified the total number that will go. However, they have said that the first 4 will go in the next week or so. So I expect those to be delivered shortly. We just don't know how many will go in total. It will be more than 4. I understand they have about 30 available. It's just not clear how many they'll send. Just before going to Wolverine, the third item back in the nest, I didn't know this. This is not getting a lot of attention. Apparently, Slovakia is now set to receive 12 AH-1 attack helicopters from the United States in exchange for those 13 MiGs, which was news to me. So it wasn't just a donation out of pure charity or goodwill to Ukraine. Wolverine, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, 2 things. One, I put on one thing. It was a story about the M1 tanks that they're going to be donating, where Ukraine is more likely going to be getting the M1A1s, which is still awesome. They're still a great platform and better than anything that the Russians have in use. The second thing was the story that you just posted about the AH-1s. Now, you have to look at when they say AH-1, they're AH-1 Zulu. So what that means is that bird, that helicopter, is the same helicopter that the United States Marine Corps just got. And those birds have so many more improvements over the old ones. They currently can carry the same combat outload that an Apache can carry, and actually more, because they can carry, like, back when we had the old AH-1 Whiskies, they were limited. Like, they could carry like 4 Hellfire, 4 TOW, and then like 2 rocket pods, and that was it. Well, the new ones can carry all the same amount of Hellfires or whatever that the Apache. They can also carry, which the Apache cannot do, is they can carry additionally 2 AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. They carry a 20mm gun. It came from the same family of the Cobras, so it's a very reliable, proven platform. The AH-1 Zulus have actually been in use since the first time I saw them was actually in I think 2009 in Afghanistan, so they've been around for a bit. The Marine Corps just got the last supply of their Zulus. So that's probably where their 12 are coming from. But the other thing that I read in that story is that Slovakia, even though they're only getting the gunships, it's a big improvement for them because they currently do not have any helicopter gunships, whether it be like the Mi-24s or not. So them getting those 12 Cobra gunships is a huge step up for them. In terms of air support, close air support for their own troops.
I totally agree that it's a great piece of kit. I was just surprised that I think there may have been rumor about Slovakia asking for these 3 or 4 months ago. I just didn't think the U.S. was inclined to give them, and then there didn't seem to be a lot of debate, and then all of a sudden, it's not the fact that it's a ring exchange gives it a little bit different tone than just Ukraine, you need these, so here you go.
Now,
yep.
sorry about that. So one thing, and it may be, this is a thing also, so because of the Marine Corps doing this force, I don't even know what they call it anymore, force protection 2030 or some crap. It's like their new battle plan. They actually were cutting down on helicopters, so they could have been already helicopters that were actually already produced for the Marine Corps, but because they are actually losing certain aviation assets with this new force 2030. So it could be that those Cobras that they got are actually birds that the Marine Corps was going to divest because of this new plan anyways. So it's not a whole, the U.S. already paid for them. So, it's like, hey, we already paid for these birds, but we don't need them. But since you've given all these MiGs to Ukraine, we're going to hook you up with the Cobras, which, like I said, that's a great platform and a great thing for Slovakia to get.
I've also heard rumor that Slovakia may be purchasing F-16s as well. So it might be worth it to the United States to work a bigger deal whereby they get the AH-1s, but the Slovakians also commit to purchase F-16s. So on a commercial basis, it might make sense.
I think that they also actually need to invest not only in the AH-1 but the UH-1, because so when they came out with the AH-1 Zulu, they came out with the UH-1 Yankee, which is the Huey. Those two birds, they share, I know, minimum 75% commonality with parts, and it actually might be higher. And those birds, the Marine Corps typically runs on kind of like a hunter-killer team. So most of the time when you see them out going on gun runs or fire sport, you actually will see one UH-1 Yankee flying out with one UH-1 Zulu, AH-1 Zulu. Like I said, compatibility of parts and the supply of parts is going to be there for quite some time. So if they also wanted, hey, we want another utility helicopter which can be used as a gunship, well, there you go. You got the Hueys, the UH-1 Yankees.
So even though it's not as charitable, it seems like the Slovakians negotiated well. Liberal, would you like to go ahead?
Hey, Michael. Yeah, so I get excited when I hear that Slovakia gave or transferred MiG-29s to Ukraine, because they have pilots that can fly them and they can be retrofitted with some of the NATO munitions. My question is, the Mirage 2000Cs that the French are offering, are they able to carry the same munitions? Of course, I would think so, but how feasible is it to give another airframe that you need train-up time on to the Ukrainians?
So before getting into the details about what the Mirage can or can't carry, it's actually, you're anticipating another story I wanted to speak to. So up in the nest, both the fourth and the fifth items, there was an article written in Le Figaro in France saying that the Ukrainians had been receiving training for several months on Mirage. But then if you look at the fifth item in the nest, I believe both the French and the Ukrainians, so the article I have is the Ukrainian Air Force coming out and saying, we have been receiving some training, some Air Force training in France, but I spoke to this briefly last night, but that training relates to survival and evasion, and it relates to some weapon system training, but it is not flight training in the way that the Figaro article described. And so whether that's plausible deniability, who knows, but I am taking it as in they're not in fact being trained on the Mirage, and therefore I don't know that the Mirage is actually on offer. So I'm not sure it's worth getting into the system's details at this point, but hopefully that covers your question. Cool. Zodiac, go ahead.
Thanks. So without jumping down that rabbit hole, like you don't want to either, Michael, of the nuances of these platforms. The biggest thing that any Western equipment that we give them, whether it be Mirages, F-16s, or whatever, even these Slovakian MiGs, is the avionics. These aircraft, especially these Slovakian and Polish MiG-29s, have Western avionics built in. The key here is that those avionics can talk to Western munitions. That's what makes them different from the MiG-29s that the Ukrainians currently have, and that's what makes it less of a MacGyvering of putting Western munitions onto some of these aircraft as well. Especially, I'm curious to see what potential munitions can be paired now with these Slovakian MiGs, that they have Western avionics that were upgraded in, I believe it was about 2008, between 2008 and 2012. So in theory, they could talk to HARM, they could talk to Maverick, and who knows what other Western munitions. So if we can get that happening, we could see new capabilities coming into the Ukrainians now. Now, the downside to this is that they'll have very limited numbers of these aircraft, so they're going to have to work them sparingly and protect these assets, because if they suddenly in a couple of months lose these aircraft, then they're going to be back to square one.
Yep, all great points. Hopefully the number is large enough between Slovakia providing 10 active plus the Polish providing some number that I assume has got to be at least equal to the Slovakian number. So, you know, that means probably 20 operational plus a bunch of spare, potentially more. Hopefully that's enough to last a fairly long time, given how carefully Ukraine has been marshaling its air resources. Okay, to close the plane topic off, I just have 3 more quick points I want to run through. They might generate a comment or two, just to give my co-hosts who are hanging with me and some others in the background a heads up on timing, maybe 5 more minutes, and then I'll wrap the space. So the last 3 items, starting the 6th back in the nest, it's a tweet by James, Intel. This came up 3 days ago. I haven't seen anybody talking about it. James is saying that North Macedonia has now confirmed they will transfer Su-25s to Ukraine, and that Mi-24 attack helicopters may follow. I'm not sure of numbers, but that seems like a significant addition as well. Okay, we'll go to Aaron and then Zodiac, and if you guys can, be brief, it would be appreciated.
Yeah, I'm hoping that these MiGs can finally, they've been follow what they call fire and forget, basically arming them, pre-arming or pre-targeting on the ground. Now, if they can arm them on the aircraft and interact with them as they would normally on Western aircraft with these MiGs, that'd be great. I hope that they can. With these MiG-29s, they've got they're not your standard MiG-29, right? So I'm just hoping that they will be able to do that. Northern Macedonia, this is some of the, finally that we're now seeing aircraft coming into the hands of Ukraine. Mi-24 Hinds are, of course, they're Soviet gunships, but they're incredibly well armored. Those things are, the Ukrainians have been using them all along. They know how to use them. They're trained on them. and they've been using them greatly since the war began. So having even more airframes is going to be even better for them now that if they're going to get Su-25s and more Mi-24 Hinds. The Russian equipment they need very little additional training on, right? So, which is awesome.
Zodiac, go ahead.
All right. Unfortunately, I'll have to put a little damper on this whole North Macedonia Su-25s. From what I've been reading and digging deeper into it, is these Su-25s from North Macedonia have not flown in about 2 decades. So their airworthiness status is very questionable. And if I had to speculate on anything, it's likely that these frames would probably be used for spare parts unless they went through some pretty heavy refurbishment and heavy repair in order to make sure that they were airworthy.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Even if they're parts donors, hopefully every little bit helps. Do you have, Zodiac, do you have any input on the status of the Mi-24 helicopters?
From what I've seen, North Macedonia has still been operating Mi-24s in a moderate fashion over the past, even up to the past 5 years. So if they are donating those are going to be in a relatively decent shape, or at least flight worthy. So that'll definitely help Ukraine.
Okay. Thanks for those updates. Last 2 points. We're now well back. I don't know what we are, 7 or 8 back. There's a post by the Kiev Independent, and they're noting that Ukraine has now submitted a request for Hornet fighters from Finland. I only came across this today. I haven't read a lot of the details. I'm just putting it out there so it's on your guys' radar. Apparently, it will require trilateral negotiations, including with Washington. Because of the debates over F-16, Washington has already said, via Pentagon spokespeople and so on, that F-16, they would have no objection to partners providing, but I haven't heard any similar, pre-approval from the United States of F-18. And so I don't know whether that might be a speed bump, but we'll have to see on that front. Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything yet either on F-18s. I've heard rumors of different possibilities, but I would say, there's a lot more airframes of F-16s than there are F-18s on a large degree. But and the F-16 is so widely available and upgradable. The F-18 is too. But these things, F-18 is there's not as many of them, and then even so, I wonder how many that they would get. It'd be awesome. Oh yeah, and I wanted to remind you if I could put a reminder in the space about the Bama report for Sunday night.
Sure.
Okay.
I think maybe with that, I will move to wrap it up. The one, so a couple last quick shout outs. Our next space will be Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. The link to that space is near the front of the nest. So set your reminders. I believe there are a lot of other speaking points I prepared. I probably clearly over-prepared. We didn't even get to the Chinese meeting with Putin. Maybe a summary. It was nothing exciting. No huge deals were reached. It was a little bit disappointing from the Russian perspective. I'll try to include some of that on in our space on Sunday. If you'd like to read about it, all of the resources are in the thread, which you can see. It's the third item in the nest where I say, join us tonight to discuss. And if you click on that, you can see all the resources if you'd like to read about it. As one final point, we are working to incorporate a geolocation challenge at the end of each space that I think Exit may be prepared to explain to us.
You bet. So I'll put this in the nest as I'm talking about it. We put together some postcards that you can take home and do as your homework. You'll see it should be in the nest now, a tweet. It has 2 postcards there. They range from easy at the top. So you're just trying to find the country for each of the photos in the postcard, and go all the way down to 2 harder ones, because I hear Brad thought the first one was way too easy, so we had to stump him on this one. And if you want to DM your answers to me, and we'll announce a winner on Sunday and give everybody the answers to the geolocation. So just something to kind of teach you a new skill, give you something to do when you walk away from here, and hopefully a little fun on your Friday night or your Saturday.
Thanks very much for that. Those are fun. I enjoy them. And we are working on a couple of ways to introduce OSINT tools and or geolocation challenges, so that we can have a little bit more education, or like sort of group collaboration to practice our skills on those things. So thanks to Exit for developing those at the end of these spaces. All right, guys, I think that's it. Thanks to everybody who spoke tonight. I think we had a terrific interview with the Bald Geek. I learned a ton about his ongoing project. If you can assist him in any way, please do reach out to him. Reminder that in my big thread right near the bottom is a tweet that includes links to all of his resources, GitHub, ADSB page, and airframe.io. I would encourage you to follow more or less all of the speakers tonight. They're all quite knowledgeable, particularly the Bald Geek. And my co-hosts, thanks to my co-hosts, you guys do a terrific job. It would be impossible to do this without you. So I hope to see all of you on Sunday night. Have a good night.